Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity settles softly and science wanders at its own quiet pace. Tonight we're travelling far north, into a place where the horizon is white, the air seems to hum, and the ground beneath your feet isn't ground at all. It's ice. Endless, ancient ice stretching in every direction like a frozen ocean. It's a world that appears silent, but beneath that frozen surface, something remarkable might be waiting. There are whispers of life buried deep under the North Pole, life so old it may have watched the planet change again and again, sealed safely away in the cold. Before we drift too far into that mystery, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're somewhere warm, where snow is just a dream, or maybe you're already wrapped in a blanket, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts slow down. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. And if you find this little expedition comforting or curious, I'd be grateful if you tapped that like button and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm corner reach others who might also want to drift through science without needing to stay wide awake for it. So, settle in, breathe a little slower, and imagine yourself standing under the pale Arctic light. It's not quite day, not quite night. The sun rolls low along the horizon, as if it can't decide whether to set or stay. The snow beneath you crunches faintly, and the air carries that dry, clean scent that only true cold can create. Somewhere, far beneath your boots, beneath hundreds of meters of ice, there might be movement. Not the kind of movement you can see or hear, but something much smaller. Cells, perhaps, older than the ice itself, surviving in tiny pockets of liquid water. They might be the quietest neighbours the planet has ever had. The North Pole feels like a place outside of time. There are no trees, no cities, not even landmarks to tell you where you are. Just the slow drift of ice floes, each piece moving according to winds and currents, carrying with it snow that fell long before anyone began writing history. Scientists often call it one of the most alien landscapes on Earth, and it's easy to understand why. The light behaves differently there. The air seems to hold sound at arm's length, and the ice forms patterns that could easily belong to another planet. Yet hidden within that frozen crust are hints of a biological story that might stretch back tens of thousands, maybe even millions of years. When we talk about life beneath the Arctic ice, it's not about polar bears or seals or the occasional fox that wanders too far. It's something much smaller, something microscopic. These are organisms that have endured isolation for epochs, adapting to a world where sunlight rarely reaches and nutrients arrive only as whispers from above. In some ways, they're like messages from another age, preserved by the perfect conditions of cold and darkness. To understand what might be living there, we first have to understand the ice itself. The Arctic ice isn't just frozen water sitting quietly. It's layered, compressed, and constantly shifting. Snow that fell thousands of years ago is now buried deep, each flake pressed into the one below until it becomes a record, a vertical timeline of the planet's past. Scientists can drill into this ice and pull out long cylinders called ice cores, each one containing tiny bubbles of ancient air. Inside those bubbles are clues about the atmosphere as it once was. The amount of carbon dioxide, the traces of volcanic ash, even microscopic fragments of pollen and dust. Sometimes, though, what they find goes beyond chemistry. Every so often, trapped in the narrow spaces between ice crystals, they find life. Not fossils or bones, but actual living cells, preserved by the cold as if time itself had agreed to pause. It might sound impossible that something so small could survive in a place so unforgiving, but the Arctic is full of surprises. Even in its most extreme conditions, there are forms of life that have adapted to the impossible. Scientists have found microbes that can endure freezing, thawing, and refreezing over and over again. They've discovered bacteria that can remain dormant for centuries, waiting for just the right moment to wake. Others can metabolize tiny amounts of nutrients trapped in the ice, surviving on what would be starvation for anything else. When you think about it, it's extraordinary that life manages to survive anywhere at all, but especially here. The North Pole is not a single piece of land like Antarctica. It's sea ice floating on top of the Arctic Ocean, drifting and changing shape with the seasons. In the summer, parts of it melt and refreeze. In the winter, it thickens and locks into silence again. Beneath that moving lid lies a deep ocean. Cold, dark, and still largely unexplored. Scientists have only recently begun to probe its depths, sending submersibles and sensors through holes cut in the ice. What they've found there hints at a world both alive and ancient. At certain depths, the water holds chemical signatures that don't quite match what comes from modern life. Methane, for instance, sometimes seeps up through cracks in the seabed, carrying with it isotopic patterns that suggest biological origins. Perhaps the remains of microorganisms that once thrived there when the world was warmer. If that's true, then buried under miles of ice and water may be ecosystems that have been sealed away since before humans learned to measure time. Imagine that for a moment. An ocean that has not seen the sun in tens of thousands of years, its surface locked beneath ice, its depths protected from storms and seasons, its inhabitants evolving in isolation. It's not so different from what scientists imagine on distant moons like Europa or Enceladus, where oceans lie beneath frozen crusts. In fact, studying the Arctic's hidden life might be our best clue for recognizing alien biology elsewhere. The conditions, cold, dark, pressurized, are remarkably similar. Some researchers even call the Arctic a natural laboratory for astrobiology. By studying how microbes survive there, we learn what to look for when exploring other worlds. The strange filaments and spores they find under Arctic ice could resemble what future missions might discover beneath extraterrestrial glaciers. That makes each frozen sample from the North Pole a kind of stand-in for samples from another planet, a preview of what life might look like under entirely different skies. Of course, extracting and studying that ice is anything but simple. The logistics of Arctic research are daunting. Temperatures can drop to levels that make metal brittle and machinery fail. Instruments freeze. Power sources must be insulated. Scientists often live in temporary camps built directly on the ice, knowing it's drifting slowly across the ocean beneath them. Every day brings subtle shifts in the surface, cracks that form and refreeze, sounds like faint thunder rolling far below. It's a place where even silence has texture. Despite those challenges, they return every year, drilling, sampling, listening to the ice. They bring back fragments that look lifeless at first glance, just frozen water and dust. But under the microscope, those fragments can reveal movement. Sometimes, when gently thawed in the lab, ancient microorganisms begin to stir. They stretch, divide, and begin to grow again, as if nothing had happened. For a few hours or days, the past becomes briefly alive, not metaphorically, but literally. These are beings that last saw sunlight before recorded history, awakened by curiosity and care in a modern laboratory. Such discoveries make scientists cautious. There's always the question of contamination. Did the microbes truly come from the ice, or were they introduced accidentally during sampling? But over the years, methods have improved. Sterile techniques, deep drilling protocols, and remote-controlled instruments reduce the chances of confusion. And the more we look, the more evidence accumulates that some of these organisms really are ancient natives of the frozen world. What makes this particularly fascinating is that ice, unlike rock, is not entirely static. It moves, compresses, melts in places, refreezes in others. That means some of these ancient cells have been carried through layers of time, perhaps from eras when the climate was warmer, when different species of microorganisms thrived in Arctic waters before being sealed away by changing conditions. Each layer of ice, then, isn't just a snapshot of the atmosphere, it's also a time capsule of life itself. Some of the most intriguing samples come from deep cores drilled through Greenland and the central Arctic Ocean. Within them, scientists have found dormant microbes alongside fossilized diatoms and other microorganisms that once floated freely in sunlit waters. That means what's buried there isn't entirely alien. It's part of a continuous biological thread stretching from ancient oceans to the present day. But in other cases, researchers encounter life forms that don't match known species, microbes with genetic codes that diverge significantly from anything catalogued. These may be remnants of lineages that once flourished in climates Earth hasn't seen for millions of years. If that sounds dramatic, it's because it quietly is. These findings suggest that the Arctic's ice sheets may hold an archive of biological history unlike any other. Fossils tell us what life looked like in stone, but ice can preserve life as it was, cells intact, DNA unbroken, even enzymes ready to function again once warmth returns. It's one of the few materials capable of freezing time both literally and biologically. Yet, as the climate warms, that time capsule is slowly opening. The Arctic is changing faster than almost any other region on Earth. Temperatures there are rising at twice the global average, melting permafrost and thinning ice. As that happens, whatever has been locked away begins to emerge. This is both an opportunity and a risk. On one hand, scientists can finally study these ancient forms before they vanish. On the other, we have no idea what some of them might do once released into modern ecosystems. Most are likely harmless, unable to compete with contemporary microbes. But nature has a long memory, and not everything that wakes up from the cold does so quietly. Still, the potential for discovery outweighs the fear for many researchers. What they hope to find in that melting ice isn't danger, but understanding. The more we know about life's resilience in the cold, the better prepared we are to recognise it elsewhere, and to appreciate its tenacity here. The Arctic becomes not just a region of Earth, but a model for survival itself. You can almost picture those microbes suspended in tiny droplets of brine, waiting patiently through millennia of freeze and thaw cycles, unaware that above them, civilizations rise and fall, continents shift, and the world changes. In their microscopic stillness lies a kind of endurance that puts our human timelines into perspective. We measure our days by clocks, our lives by decades, but these organisms measure theirs in ice ages. Standing at the North Pole, if you could dig through that frozen crust and peer into the dark beneath, you'd see something entirely different from the sterile void most imagine. You'd see faint light from bioluminescent plankton, drifting particles of organic matter, and perhaps the delicate shimmer of bacterial colonies living in film-thin layers of liquid water that never fully freeze. Life doesn't vanish in the cold, it adapts, it slows, compresses, redefines what it means to be alive. And maybe that's the quiet lesson of the Arctic. Even in the most barren, frozen corners of our planet, there is motion, memory, persistence. Ice isn't the absence of life. It's a form of preservation, a pause button pressed by nature itself. What lies beneath the North Pole may not be a bustling ecosystem, but it could be a living link to the planet's deep past, a reminder that life endures not only through strength, but through patience. And so, as we stand on this imagined sheet of ice, listening to the wind skim across its surface, it's easy to forget that below us, in darkness and silence, the story of life continues. Slowly, invisibly, but continuously. That's where our exploration truly begins, not in what we can see above, but in what has waited below for longer than we can fully comprehend. The Arctic can look deceivingly simple from above, just a sheet of white stretching as far as the eye can see, but that white hides more than it reveals. Most people imagine the North Pole as solid land covered by ice, but that isn't quite true. It's an ocean, restless and deep, capped by a floating lid of frozen water. From above it seems motionless, but the truth is that it never stops moving. The ice drifts, cracks, collides, reforms, and drifts again. It's a slow ballet of cold geometry, driven by winds and currents that care nothing for the lines humans draw on maps. This constant shifting is part of what makes the Arctic both fascinating and difficult to study. The world below is hidden not just by darkness, but by motion, always changing, never still long enough to be fully known. Those who've stood on the ice describe it as being alive in its own strange way. It creaks, moans and pops, as if breathing. Sometimes the sound comes from fractures opening and closing as the floes grind together. Sometimes it's the echo of faraway pressure ridges building up and collapsing under their own weight. To the untrained ear, it can sound eerie, but to the scientists who work there, it's a kind of conversation between the ocean and the sky. Beneath those noises, beneath meters of compacted snow, lies the beginning of the darkness, a place where light fades quickly and temperature drops toward extremes that would end most forms of life instantly. And yet, somehow, they endure. When the sun dips low over the Arctic horizon, it paints everything in shades of pale gold and blue, but below the surface, the world becomes almost black. Light can only penetrate a few meters into the thick sea ice, and what little reaches the water below quickly dissolves into gloom. Still, even here, there is movement. Tiny organisms drift in microscopic clouds, feeding on nutrients that rise from the depths or on the faint traces of photosynthesis from seasons past. In this perpetual twilight, every scrap of energy counts. The creatures that live here have evolved to make the most of scarcity. They move slowly, reproduce rarely, and conserve every possible calorie. To the human eye, it might look lifeless, but under magnification, the Arctic waters are dense with invisible motion. Researchers who lower cameras and sensors beneath the ice often describe what they find as both alien and oddly familiar. Curtains of ice crystals hang from the underside of the floes like underwater stalactites. They grow downward in strange shapes, sometimes forming delicate tunnels or shimmering sheets. Between those icy structures, tiny shrimp-like amphipods drift and feed, along with translucent worms and jellyfish no larger than a fingertip. Each one is part of a food web that somehow sustains itself in conditions that would kill most marine life elsewhere. Every few years, a new expedition reveals another species previously unknown to science, a reminder that even on our own planet, large swathes of biology remain unseen. It's strange to think that this harsh environment, so far removed from ordinary life, might actually be one of Earth's oldest biological refuges. Some of the microbial communities found here resemble those thought to exist billions of years ago, when the planet was younger, cooler, and bathed in a dimmer sun. The Arctic, in a sense, is a time machine. By studying its organisms, scientists can peer into the deep past, learning how early life might have survived when Earth itself was covered in ice during what's known as the snowball Earth periods. These were times when glaciers reached the equator, when the planet was so cold that oceans froze almost entirely over. Yet even then, life persisted, clinging to hydrothermal vents and to thin films of liquid water beneath the ice, much as it does today beneath the polar cap. To access that world, researchers use specialized drills capable of penetrating hundreds of meters through ice. The process is slow, often taking days, and each step must be carefully managed to prevent contamination. When a core is finally extracted, it's more than just a column of frozen water. It's a layered record of climate, chemistry, and biology. Each centimetre can represent decades or even centuries of accumulation. Trapped within are air bubbles containing ancient atmospheres, tiny dust particles from distant deserts, and occasionally something even smaller. A single living cell, dormant but intact. These microscopic time travellers are preserved by conditions so stable and cold that their biological machinery simply paused. Once these samples are brought to a laboratory, scientists handle them as though they were artifacts. The ice must be melted under controlled conditions, and the resulting water filtered for any sign of life. Sometimes they find nothing. Other times, under the right combination of temperature and nutrients, a cell will stir. It's one of the most quietly dramatic moments in science, a twitch under the microscope that signals something ancient has just resumed living. It's not resurrection in the supernatural sense, just biology obeying the laws of persistence. That small flicker of movement means that even after thousands of years, life remains possible. Not all the life beneath the Arctic comes from ancient origins, though. Some of it migrates downwards seasonally, following the rhythm of the surface world above. During the brief Arctic summer, when sunlight returns and sea ice melts, blooms of phytoplankton erupt across the ocean. These tiny plant-like organisms capture sunlight and carbon dioxide, creating a short but intense pulse of productivity. When the sun disappears again for the long winter, much of that organic matter sinks into the depths, feeding bacteria and other organisms below. In this way, the Arctic functions as both a cradle and a grave, a place where life begins in a frenzy of light, then descends into the calm of darkness to be recycled and reborn. What makes the North Pole particularly mysterious is how little we truly know about what lies beneath its thickest regions. Unlike the Antarctic, where scientists have drilled into subglacial lakes like Vostok, the Arctic Ocean's central basin remains largely unexplored. The ice there can reach several meters in thickness, and beneath it the ocean plunges to depths exceeding 4,000 meters. It's a world defined by pressure, cold, and silence. Even modern submersibles struggle to operate in such conditions. Still, brief glimpses gathered from remotely operated vehicles have revealed microbial mats clinging to rocks and sediments on the seafloor, communities that survive by drawing energy from chemical reactions rather than sunlight. They oxidize methane and sulfur compounds, much like the microbes found near hydrothermal vents in warmer seas. These chemical processes may be ancient, perhaps among the earliest metabolic strategies to evolve on Earth. If life can thrive in these isolated, energy-poor environments, it raises an intriguing question. Could similar systems exist on other worlds? Scientists studying icy moons like Europa and Enceladus often use the Arctic as an analogue. The similarities are striking. Both are covered in ice, both conceal liquid water below, and both experience minimal sunlight. In fact, experiments designed to simulate conditions on Europa often use Arctic microbes as test subjects. The results consistently show that many of them could survive, and possibly even grow, under extraterrestrial conditions. It's a reminder that the boundary between astrobiology and Earth biology is thinner than we once thought. For now, though, all of that remains speculative. The reality of Arctic exploration is much more physical. Researchers endure months of darkness, storms that can tear through camps in minutes, and temperatures that turn breath into crystals. They work in layers of insulated suits, taking turns monitoring instruments that can freeze solid if left unattended. Meals are quick, sleep is brief, and yet there's a strange tranquility to it all. Out there, far from cities and noise, time stretches. The pace of work matches the rhythm of the environment. Slow, deliberate, careful. Every sample collected represents not just a scientific effort, but a small act of patience. Beneath the surface, the darkness is not absolute. Bioluminescent organisms create faint, ghostly glows, pinpoints of green and blue that drift like slow sparks in the black water. To a camera, it looks almost like a starfield inverted. These tiny bursts of light are signals, communication, sometimes defense mechanisms. They remind us that even in the most extreme cold, ecosystems find ways to express themselves. There are predators and prey, hunters and scavengers, all operating on a scale that makes our understanding of complexity seem small. The deeper you go, the more the Arctic resembles the early Earth. Without sunlight, energy flows through chemistry alone. Methane seeps from the seabed, feeding bacteria that convert it into biomass. Those bacteria in turn feed small animals, which feed others, creating chains of dependency entirely detached from the sun. This is life built not on light, but on persistence, proof that biology can adapt to nearly any condition given enough time, and perhaps that's the most humbling part of it. Time is abundant down there. While human generations rise and fall, these systems change almost imperceptibly, Their clock ticks at the pace of glaciers. Back on the surface, the Arctic's appearance can shift overnight. Storms rearrange the ice, piling it into ridges or splitting it into flows that drift apart. Satellites track these movements, mapping how the ice shrinks each year as the planet warms. With every lost square kilometre, another window opens into the water below, and scientists rush to study what was once hidden. But this urgency is double-edged. As the ice retreats, so too does the stability that kept these ancient systems isolated. What we gain in knowledge may come at the cost of the very environment that preserves it. Still, curiosity drives the work forward. Each expedition returns with data, samples, and sometimes entirely new questions. For instance, some researchers have found layers of ice containing organic compounds that shouldn't be there. Complex molecules that hint at biological processes. Others have detected faint isotopic ratios in methane and carbon trapped in permafrost that suggest microbial activity dating back tens of thousands of years. These clues don't form a complete picture yet, but together they hint that beneath the Arctic's frozen ceiling, life never truly stopped. It just slowed to the barest minimum, conserving energy until conditions improve. Even in the absence of proof, there's something deeply compelling about the idea that life might be sleeping beneath the pole. It challenges our assumptions about where living things belong. For centuries, humans viewed the Arctic as barren, a void at the top of the world, useful only as a testing ground for endurance. Now we see it differently. It's not an empty space, but a dynamic one, filled with motion, memory, and potential. The white above hides a complexity that rivals tropical coral reefs, just colder, slower, and quieter. To imagine what it feels like to stand there, think of stillness so complete that you can hear the faint vibration of your own heartbeat through your coat. Think of the horizon blending with the sky until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. The Arctic does that. It erases boundaries, not just physical ones, but mental. It makes you aware of how small you are, how short-lived compared to the ice that moves beneath you. And yet, in that humility, there's a sense of belonging. The same processes that shape the ice, the same atoms that make up the snowflakes, are the ones that build our cells. The Arctic isn't alien. It's a mirror showing us what endurance looks like when stripped of comfort. If the ice below does indeed hide ancient life, then studying it is more than a scientific exercise. It's a way of connecting to a lineage that stretches back to the beginnings of biology itself. It's the pursuit of understanding not just how life survives, but why it refuses to disappear. Each microbe recovered from those depths is a quiet testimony that existence, once begun, is stubborn. It adapts, it hides, it waits. In that way, the Arctic doesn't just contain Earth's oldest secrets, it embodies them. The white world above, so serene and quiet, and the darkness below, so patient and full of secrets, are part of the same continuum. What seems lifeless from one perspective teems with activity from another. The frozen ocean isn't a barrier but a bridge, connecting the living world we know with the deep past we can barely imagine. And as the seasons turn and the ice breathes with the slow rhythm of the planet, that connection remains, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be understood. The farther scientists look into the ice, the more it begins to resemble an archive. Not an archive built of paper or stone, but one made of temperature and pressure, where every layer tells a story about a moment that once was. Each snowfall becomes a page, compressed by the next until centuries blur into meters of ice. When you stand on the polar surface, you're standing not on a single moment, but on thousands stacked together, a vertical history of the planet written in frost. And buried inside those layers is something far more delicate than any fossil. Evidence of life that has outlasted the ages simply by being frozen. Ice has a peculiar relationship with time. It doesn't just preserve, it slows everything down to the point where decay almost stops. In the Arctic, temperatures can stay below freezing for millennia. Chemical reactions that would destroy organic material elsewhere barely happen here. That means air trapped in the ice remains almost identical to the atmosphere it came from. Tiny fragments of pollen stay intact, volcanic ash remains sharp, and microbes, if they were caught in the snowfall, might still be waiting for the warmth that will let them move again. The North Pole becomes a kind of biological time capsule, a frozen record of not only climate, but also of life itself. When scientists drill for cores, they're not just chasing numbers or data, they're opening doors into deep time. A section of ice just a few meters long might span several thousand years. As each layer melts under laboratory lights, it releases whispers of long-lost air, particles, and cells. The deeper they go, the older the ice becomes, and the more alien the world it represents. Somewhere near the bottom of those cores are layers that formed when mammoths still walked the tundra, when forests stretched farther north, and when human footprints were still rare in Arctic snow. Every bubble, every speck of dust carries the chemical signature of that vanished era. It's tempting to think of this as simple preservation, but the truth is more dynamic. Ice doesn't just trap things, it interacts with them. Within its structure are microchannels where thin films of liquid water persist even at freezing temperatures. Those films create miniature habitats, just a few molecules thick, where certain microbes can remain active, extremely slowly, but still alive. They metabolize trace amounts of carbon, repair their DNA, and keep their biological machinery intact. To call them living fossils wouldn't be quite right. They're not fossils, they're neighbours that happen to live on a different timeline. One of the most surprising discoveries from Arctic cores is the diversity of microbial DNA found in even the oldest samples. Genetic sequencing reveals bacteria, archaea, and even viral fragments that predate many modern ecosystems. Some of these genetic sequences don't match any known organism on Earth today. They may represent ancient lineages that disappeared elsewhere but found refuge in the cold. When researchers analyse these sequences, they sometimes find similarities to microbes that thrive in extreme environments, deep ocean vents, Antarctic lakes, or permafrost soils. That connection suggests that life in the Arctic isn't just surviving by chance. It's part of a global network of extremophils that have quietly persisted through every major extinction event. In some cases, scientists have been able to revive bacteria from ice that's more than 500,000 years old. Under sterile conditions, they melt the samples, provide nutrients, and wait. Most of the time, nothing happens. But every so often a cell divides, then another, until a colony begins to grow. It's a moment that blurs the line between past and present. These organisms didn't evolve in our time, they simply paused in theirs. To see them active again is to witness continuity on a scale that human experience can barely grasp. What's fascinating is how these ancient microbes adapt once they awaken. Many remain metabolically slow even at room temperature, as if reluctant to abandon their long dormancy. Others adjust quickly, dividing and reproducing as though no time had passed. This variability tells scientists something about how evolution operates under extreme constraints. It's not always about constant change. Sometimes survival depends on knowing when not to change at all. In the frozen Arctic world, stillness becomes its own form of adaptation. The chemistry of ancient ice offers other lessons too. By measuring the ratios of certain isotopes, oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, researchers can reconstruct past climates with remarkable accuracy. They can tell when volcanic eruptions cooled the planet, when warm periods melted the ice sheets, and when sudden freezes transformed landscapes overnight. These reconstructions align closely with records found in tree rings, sediment layers, and coral reefs. But unlike those, ice captures more than the story of temperature. It holds fragments of life that experience those changes firsthand. Dust grains contain pollen, spores, and microbial cells carried by winds from distant continents. When analysed, these traces reveal how ecosystems responded to shifting climates. how species migrated, adapted, or disappeared. Every so often, something truly unexpected appears. In 2014, researchers studying ice cores from Greenland found fragments of genetic material that seemed to come from marine organisms, even though the sampling site was hundreds of kilometers from the ocean. The explanation, they believe, is that strong storms once carried seawater droplets inland, where they froze into the snow. Along with those droplets came microbes from the ocean's surface. That means the ice above the North Pole might also contain DNA from multiple environments, marine, atmospheric and terrestrial, all mixed together in a layered record of global connectivity. The age of frozen time is in that sense not just a poetic idea, but a literal one. The Arctic ice preserves a continuous link between the present and the deep past. It bridges worlds that would otherwise never meet. The warm tropics and the frozen poles, the living biosphere and the realm of suspended animation. It even bridges different definitions of time. For humans, centuries are vast. For ice, they're barely an instant. A layer that took 100 years to form might be just a few centimeters thick. To extract that layer is to compress generations into a single sample tube. When people first began studying Arctic ice seriously in the mid-20th century, the goal was to understand climate. The presence of life within it was almost a curiosity, a side note. But over time, that side note became central. Microbiologists realized that the cells preserved in ice could serve as models for how life endures in space, on other planets, or in the early Earth's volatile conditions. NASA has funded several Arctic research missions specifically for this reason. If life can survive suspended for thousands of years in the cold and dark here, then perhaps similar forms could persist on Mars or the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn. The Arctic became a proving ground for theories of panspermia, the idea that life could travel between worlds, hitching rides on frozen comets or meteorites. There's also a philosophical angle that scientists rarely voice but often feel. When you're holding a vial containing water melted from ancient ice, you're not just holding data, you're holding time that was once solid. You're touching a piece of the world that existed before human memory, before civilization, before language. It's humbling. It makes you aware of the scale at which nature operates and how temporary our own footprints are. The ice doesn't hurry. It doesn't rush to reveal its contents. It releases them slowly, grain by grain, as if making sure we're ready to understand what it's giving back. The stability of Arctic ice is part of what has allowed these discoveries, but that stability is fragile. As global temperatures rise, the structure of ancient layers begins to degrade. Meltwater seeps into old ice, diluting and sometimes erasing records that took tens of millennia to form. In some regions, scientists now work with urgency, racing to collect cores before they vanish entirely. Every lost glacier, every collapsed shelf is another chapter gone forever. The irony is that the same warming that makes new discoveries possible, by exposing previously inaccessible regions, also ensures that much of what we could have learned will soon be gone. Even as the surface melts, deeper layers remain locked in permafrost and basal ice. Some of those may never fully thaw, but as permafrost soils begin to warm, they release trapped gases like methane and carbon dioxide. Along with those gases come dormant microbes. Some reawaken harmlessly, becoming part of the soil ecosystem again. Others are so ancient that their modern relatives no longer exist. In rare cases, researchers have isolated viruses from thawing permafrost that can still infect contemporary hosts, though not humans. It's a reminder that the frozen past isn't inert, it's simply waiting. The boundary between ancient and modern life is not as firm as we'd like to think. All of this makes the Arctic a paradoxical place. It's both the oldest and youngest region on Earth in terms of what it reveals. Each melting layer uncovers something new that is in reality very old. The more we study it, the more the concept of now becomes blurred. A molecule of air released from melting ice could have last touched the atmosphere when saber-toothed cats prowled the steppe. A microbe revived in a lab today might be the direct descendant of one that lived when humans first used fire. That continuity stretches across unimaginable spans of time, yet it's happening quietly, almost invisibly, beneath our feet. Scientists often describe this as a dialogue with the past, but it's not a conversation in words. It's in chemistry, DNA, and isotopes. The ice speaks through patterns, through ratios, through the slow exhalation of ancient air. Understanding it requires patience, precision, and respect for scale. Each dataset adds another layer to our understanding, just as each snowfall adds a layer to the ice itself. The process mirrors the very phenomenon it studies: accumulation, compression, preservation. Knowledge builds the same way the Arctic does, slowly, methodically, one flake at a time. Working with ice cores is not glamorous. The drills are noisy, the conditions brutal, the work repetitive. Yet there's a kind of reverence in it. Every sample pulled from the borehole is handled like treasure. Technicians wear sterile gloves, instruments are cleaned between each cut, and samples are stored in freezers colder than the environment they came from. Back in laboratories far from the ice, scientists wait for the moment when those cores arrive. When they finally do, they're sliced into segments, catalogued, and examined under microscopes or mass spectrometers. It can take months to process a single core. The results, though, can redefine how we see the planet. For example, by comparing layers of Arctic ice to those from Antarctica, researchers can trace how global climate systems interact. The two poles, though separated by half a planet, often respond in tandem to major events: volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or shifts in ocean circulation. This synchronicity suggests that the Earth's climate, though complex, behaves like a single organism, with the poles serving as its memory centres. They record every breath, every fever, every sigh of the planet. And within those records, among the traces of air and dust, lie the faint signatures of life that weathered it all. It's remarkable how much meaning can be contained in something as simple as frozen water. Each crystal, each trapped bubble, is a reminder that the line between geology and biology is not as clear as textbooks make it seem. The Arctic ice is both mineral and living archive, both environment and inhabitant. It shapes life, and life shapes it in return. Over time, even the smallest cells influence the chemistry of the ice, altering how it reflects light or stores heat. In that way, the story of the frozen pole is not just about what's hidden beneath. It's about how life and ice have always been intertwined, shaping each other in cycles too slow for us to notice in a single lifetime. The age of frozen time is still unfolding, even now. As more samples are collected and analysed, as new instruments measure finer details, we continue to uncover layers of history written in frost. Some of those layers hold direct lessons about climate change and planetary systems. Others hold whispers of biology that remind us how resilient life can be. All of them together form a mosaic that stretches backward across the ages, connecting our brief moment to the deep endurance of the planet itself. And beneath all of it, the darkness waits, holding what it always has: stories older than language, written in cold, waiting patiently for someone to listen. When most people imagine life, they picture warmth, sunlight, greenery, motion, the pulse of heat that runs through every living thing. The idea that something could thrive in the deep cold feels contradictory. Cold slows movement, halts reactions, and locks water, the very foundation of life, into rigidity. Yet, against all logic, microbes have found ways not only to endure such conditions, but to make them home. In the Arctic, they occupy every available niche: frozen soil, glacial ice, sea brine, and even the thin boundary between air and snow. If the region above the ice is a desert of cold air, the world beneath is an invisible city of microscopic survivalists. Scientists have spent decades trying to understand how these tiny organisms function where almost nothing else can. At first glance, a sample of Arctic ice looks sterile. Hold it to the light and it appears clear, lifeless. But under magnification, that illusion dissolves. Tiny specks, cells, spores, filaments, float between crystals, each one carrying the potential for activity. Some are metabolically active even at sub-zero temperatures. Others have been dormant for hundreds or thousands of years, waiting for the faintest change in their surroundings to begin again. These microbes don't resist the cold so much as they've learned to use it. The adaptations that allow this are astonishing in their simplicity. Inside their cells are proteins that act as natural antifreeze, preventing ice crystals from forming and puncturing delicate membranes. Some species alter the composition of their cell walls to remain flexible, even when most organic material would become brittle. Others rely on special enzymes that continue to function in near-frozen water, processing nutrients at a pace that makes ordinary metabolism look frantic by comparison. For every degree the temperature drops, these reactions slow, but they never fully stop. The microbes simply match the pace of their surroundings, shrinking time down until motion and stillness become almost the same thing. Researchers who study them often describe the experience as humbling. When a sample from ancient ice is warmed carefully in a sterile container, the first signs of life are almost imperceptible. A slight change in colour, a faint clouding of the liquid, sometimes a tiny gas bubble. These small cues mark the return of activity after possibly tens of millennia. No flourish, no drama, just a quiet confirmation that life never left. It only paused. The patience built into such a system is difficult for us to imagine. Human lives measure in decades. These organisms measure in geological time. The study of microbes in extreme environments has become a field of its own, known as extremophile research. The Arctic provides a natural laboratory for it. The temperatures are consistently low, radiation from the sun is limited, and nutrients are scarce. In other words, the Arctic offers almost every condition that should make life impossible. Yet the results show the opposite. Wherever scientists look, within brine channels, in permafrost layers, in the basal ice beneath glaciers, they find communities of microorganisms quietly maintaining ecosystems invisible to the naked eye. One of the most intriguing habitats is the network of tiny brine channels that thread through sea ice. When seawater freezes, the salt is excluded from the ice crystals and becomes concentrated in small pockets of liquid. These pockets remain unfrozen even at very low temperatures, because the high salt concentration lowers their freezing point. Within them, microbes find just enough liquid water to persist. They form thin films on the walls of the channels, feeding on trace nutrients, recycling organic matter from decaying plankton, and even exchanging genetic material. To a human observer, these channels are microscopic. To the microbes living inside, they are entire worlds, stable, enclosed, and connected by the slow movement of brine. The diversity within these microhabitats is remarkable. Scientists have identified bacteria, archaea, algae, and even microscopic fungi living side by side. Some produce pigments that protect them from the faint ultraviolet light filtering through the ice. Others generate small amounts of heat through metabolic activity, just enough to keep their microenvironment liquid. The result is a self-sustaining system that operates on the smallest possible scale. If one part of the network fails, another compensates. Its resilience built from cooperation rather than competition, a pattern that repeats across nearly all forms of microbial life in the cold. Permafrost, the permanently frozen soil found across the Arctic, holds an even greater store of microbial diversity. These soils have been frozen for hundreds of thousands of years, locking away organic material and the organisms that once processed it. When scientists extract cores of permafrost, they find dormant spores and viable cells that can be revived in the lab. Some of these microorganisms are unknown to science, with genetic sequences that differ significantly from any living species. They may represent ancient branches of life that diverged long before modern ecosystems took shape. In a sense, they're living fossils that escaped extinction by withdrawing from time. The implications go far beyond the Arctic. By studying how these microbes survive, researchers gain insight into what early life on Earth might have looked like. The conditions within permafrost, low temperature, limited light, scarcity of energy, closely resemble those that existed during the planet's earliest epochs. Life may have begun in environments very similar to these, where metabolism was slow and energy had to be conserved meticulously. The biochemical strategies found in Arctic microbes, anti-freeze proteins, protective enzymes, DNA repair systems, could be the modern remnants of mechanisms that first allowed life to persist when the young Earth was hostile and unpredictable. These discoveries have also changed how we think about where life might exist beyond Earth. For missions to Mars, Europa, or Enceladus, understanding cold-loving microbes is essential. Space agencies often test equipment designed for those missions in the Arctic, because it provides the closest analogue available. When drills or landers operate in these conditions, they reveal not just the engineering challenges, but the biological possibilities. If microbes can function within micrometers of liquid water, trapped in ice here, there's no reason to believe they couldn't do the same elsewhere. In this way, the Arctic becomes a stand-in for distant worlds, a test case for the persistence of life itself. On a more immediate level, these microbes also influence the modern Arctic ecosystem. Though invisible, they form the foundation of the food web. They recycle nutrients, break down organic matter, and release gases that influence the chemistry of the ocean and atmosphere. In winter, when photosynthesis stops, microbial communities continue to operate in the dark, using stored carbon and chemical energy to keep the system running. When spring returns, they provide the nutrients that fuel the explosive growth of plankton at the surface. Without them, the Arctic's seasonal cycles would collapse. Understanding their role has become increasingly important as the climate warms. Rising temperatures change the balance of microbial life. Species that once thrived only in deep ice begin to appear closer to the surface. Dormant cells that had been stable for millennia are exposed and reawakened. New pathways for decomposition open up, releasing greenhouse gases that further accelerate warming. It's a feedback loop that connects microbiology to global climate patterns. Tiny cells, invisible to the naked eye, influence the temperature of the entire planet. There's a certain irony in that. For years, we considered the Arctic a passive environment, a frozen backdrop to the more active processes happening elsewhere. Now we know it's anything but passive. It's a dynamic engine of chemical and biological reactions, powered by microbes that never stop working. Even at -20 degrees Celsius, even in total darkness, metabolism continues. The pace may be slow, but over geological time, slow is enough to reshape the world. In the laboratory, studying these organisms presents challenges of its own. Many cannot be cultured by standard methods. Their requirements are too specific, their tolerance for temperature and pressure too narrow. Scientists have had to develop new techniques, cryogenic microscopes that allow direct observation at freezing temperatures, genetic sequencing methods that work with minute amounts of DNA, and models that simulate Arctic conditions in miniature. Even then, much of what we know comes from indirect evidence, chemical markers, gene fragments, isotopic ratios. The full complexity of these ecosystems remains beyond our reach. Despite those limitations, the discoveries keep coming. Researchers have identified enzymes from Arctic microbes that remain stable and active at low temperatures, with potential uses in medicine, food processing, and biotechnology. Others have found bacteria that can absorb heavy metals or break down pollutants even in cold environments, offering tools for environmental cleanup in regions where conventional methods fail. The same adaptations that allow survival in ice make these organisms valuable allies in solving practical problems. There's also something quietly beautiful about their persistence. Imagine being a single cell trapped between ice crystals surrounded by nothing but salt water and silence. Every reaction, every repair takes years. Yet, in that stillness you continue. The cell membrane holds. the genetic code remains intact. Energy trickles in, barely enough to maintain balance, but enough. The microbe waits. It has no awareness of waiting, of course, no concept of time or memory. But its existence is a testament to the simplest and most powerful rule of life. Don't stop. This persistence raises questions about what defines being alive. If a microbe spends 10,000 years in near-complete dormancy, waking for only brief intervals of activity, is it living continuously or intermittently? From a biological perspective, the distinction doesn't matter. The cell survives, reproduces when it can, and contributes to the continuity of its species. But philosophically, it challenges our understanding of life as constant activity. In the Arctic, existence becomes a matter of endurance rather than motion. Field researchers who spend time on the ice often speak of how their perspective changes. Working in sub-zero temperatures for weeks at a time alters your sense of speed, urgency, even purpose. Everything must be planned, deliberate, methodical. Every step consumes energy that must be conserved. The environment enforces patience. In that way, studying Arctic microbes becomes an exercise in empathy. You begin to live, briefly, by their tempo. The slow rhythm of work, the measured handling of samples, the long waits for results mirror the rhythms of the organisms themselves. Occasionally, these scientists witness small moments that remind them of why the effort matters. A culture dish that shows faint signs of growth after months of nothing. A new genetic sequence that hints at an unknown lineage. A camera recording a film of microbial activity beneath the ice. These moments may not make headlines, but they shift understanding in profound ways. Each discovery confirms that life's reach extends farther than we imagined, not just across the planet, but across time. The presence of microbes in the cold also forces us to reconsider extinction. We often think of extinction as an endpoint, a permanent erasure. But for these organisms, survival can mean suspension. A species might disappear from the surface world yet continue to exist, preserved in ice or permafrost, waiting for conditions to align again. It's a subtler, slower form of continuity, one that operates outside our usual perception of life and death. In that sense, the Arctic acts as a vast biological archive, not just preserving the past but keeping it viable. Every new sample adds to this archive. Every analysis uncovers another layer of adaptation. And as technology improves, scientists can read those layers with greater clarity. They can identify not only who these microbes are, but how they interact, how they communicate chemically, how they organize themselves into communities that share resources. These interactions reveal principles that apply far beyond the Arctic. They show how cooperation, efficiency, and patience allow ecosystems to persist even under stress. They remind us that survival isn't always about strength or dominance. Sometimes it's about slowing down enough to match the environment you inhabit. The microbes in the cold don't fight the ice. They align with it. They move at its pace, adopt its stillness, and in doing so, they endure. They've been doing so since long before humans named this region, long before our species learned to measure time or temperature. In their quiet persistence lies the history of life's resilience, written not in fossils or bones, but in invisible cells drifting beneath the surface. And as we continue to study them, we begin to understand that the story of the Arctic isn't just about a place. It's about the nature of endurance itself, about the capacity of life to remain present even when almost everything else stops moving. Beneath the Arctic ice lies an ocean that almost no one ever sees. It covers millions of square kilometres, a vast dark expanse that circles the pole like a hidden heart. Most of it remains unexplored, not because it's distant, but because it's sealed. The thick crust of sea ice above makes it one of the hardest places on Earth to reach. There are no natural openings, no easy entry points. To study it, scientists must drill, dive, or send machines capable of surviving pressure, cold, and complete darkness. For decades, it was thought of as a kind of biological desert, too hostile to support more than a few drifting microbes. But the deeper the exploration goes, the clearer it becomes that the ocean under the pole is not empty. It's alive in ways that challenge how we define life's limits. The first images from under-ice submersibles came as a shock. Instead of barren seafloor and silent black water, cameras revealed movement, slow clouds of plankton, delicate threads of jellyfish, small fish navigating under the ice ceiling as though it were a mirror turned upside down. Where light filters through thinner patches, ice algae grow in sheets, feeding entire micro-ecosystems that stretch downward. The frozen ceiling, once imagined as lifeless, turns out to be more like a floating meadow, faint, pale, but thriving. That realization changed everything. What lies beneath isn't a void, it's an inverted world with its own rules and rhythms. The ocean here is divided into layers, each one colder and denser than the one above. At the surface, just beneath the ice, there's a narrow band of water that interacts with sunlight for part of the year. Below that lies a mid-layer where temperatures stabilize just above freezing, and light fades completely. Beyond that, in the deep basins, water becomes nearly motionless, so still that sediment falls like slow snow. It's here, in this permanent twilight, that some of the oldest and strangest life forms persist. They don't rely on sunlight or oxygen from the air above. Instead, they draw energy from the slow decay of organic matter, sinking from the upper layers, or from chemical reactions between water and the Earth's crust. To understand this hidden ocean, scientists deploy remotely operated vehicles that can withstand the pressure and transmit data through kilometers of cable. These machines move slowly, guided by pilots watching grainy video feeds from above the ice. What they record often defies expectations. In places where there should be nothing, they find mats of bacteria coating rocks and sediments. These mats are not random patches of life. They're organized colonies, working collectively to process nutrients. The microbes oxidize methane and sulfur, producing energy in complete darkness. Similar communities have been found at hydrothermal vents thousands of kilometers away, suggesting that these systems are part of a much larger global pattern of deep-sea chemistry. One of the most mysterious features of the Arctic Ocean is its methane seeps. In certain regions, plumes of gas bubble up from the seabed, escaping into the water above. Some of this methane likely comes from geological sources, but a portion may be biological, generated by microbes that break down organic matter trapped in sediments. Around these seeps, microbial life flourishes. Specialized bacteria form partnerships with small worms and crustaceans, creating miniature ecosystems that recycle energy in complete isolation from the sun. In this way, the Arctic deep behaves like a self-contained biosphere, sustained by chemistry rather than light. The conditions in these regions are extreme. Temperatures hover around -1 to -2 degrees Celsius, and pressure increases by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. At 3,000 meters below the surface, that's 300 times the pressure we feel at sea level. Yet life adapts. Membranes become more flexible, enzymes more stable, and metabolism more efficient. Some organisms produce special proteins that prevent ice crystals from forming in their cells, while others adjust their internal chemistry to match the salinity and pressure of their surroundings. These adaptations don't just allow survival, they enable thriving in an environment that would destroy most known life forms. The deep Arctic is also home to unique geological formations. Along the Lomonosov Ridge and other underwater mountain chains, there are regions of hydrothermal activity where mineral-rich fluids seep from the seabed. Though not as dramatic as the black smokers found near the equator, these Arctic vents provide heat and nutrients that sustain dense microbial communities. Chemosynthetic bacteria here feed on hydrogen sulfide, methane and other reduced compounds, forming the base of an entire food web. Small crustaceans graze on the bacterial mats, while larger organisms feed on them in turn. Even in the absence of sunlight, energy continues to flow through the system, proving that life can organize itself wherever chemistry allows. Exploring these regions takes patience. Every expedition involves careful planning, months of preparation, and equipment designed for precision. The ice above shifts constantly, closing paths one day and opening new ones the next. Navigation under the ice requires acoustic mapping since GPS signals can't penetrate. Communication with submersibles is limited to slow data relays through cables or sonar pings. Each sample brought to the surface must be handled immediately to prevent contamination or temperature shock. Even the act of collecting water from such depths is delicate. Scientists use insulated bottles that close at specific depths, preserving the pressure and temperature until they can be analysed on board. What they find in those samples often redefines what's possible for biology. For instance, one expedition discovered bacteria capable of metabolizing methane at temperatures just below freezing. These microbes consume the gas before it reaches the atmosphere, effectively acting as a natural regulator. Their existence has significant implications for climate science. As the Arctic warms and more methane seeps are exposed, the balance between emission and consumption will shift. Understanding these microbial processes could help predict how much greenhouse gas will ultimately escape into the air. The ocean beneath the pole, then, isn't just an isolated ecosystem. It's an active participant in Earth's climate system, influencing conditions far beyond its boundaries. Further down, near the seafloor, sediments accumulate in layers that mirror the history of the ice above. Each layer holds particles of dust, organic material, and microscopic shells that record changes in ocean circulation and productivity. Embedded within them are traces of DNA from organisms that lived and died thousands of years ago. These genetic remnants form a kind of biological sediment record, allowing researchers to reconstruct past ecosystems. It's through these studies that we learn how the Arctic has changed over millennia, how species adapted to periods of warming and cooling, and how entire microbial populations shifted as the ocean chemistry evolved. The hidden ocean also reveals something about the limits of exploration itself. Even with modern technology, we've mapped only a fraction of its floor. The rest remains mystery, a region where each new expedition finds unfamiliar shapes and signals. Sonar occasionally detects structures rising from the bottom, columns or domes that may be mineral formations or large bacterial colonies. Until instruments can reach and sample them directly, their nature remains speculative. The uncertainty is part of what drives scientists to return again and again, despite the cost and risk. Every journey under the ice feels like the first, because the Arctic does not give up its secrets easily. One of the more haunting discoveries came from cores taken from deep sediments near the pole. Within those layers, researchers found fossilized remains of microorganisms that appeared to have lived when the region was much warmer. Chemical analysis suggested that millions of years ago the Arctic Ocean supported rich plankton communities similar to those in today's temperate seas. As global temperatures dropped, those ecosystems retreated or adapted, leaving behind the sparse but resilient life we see today. That transition from abundance to austerity is written in the chemistry of the sediments, a reminder that the hidden ocean has been through countless cycles of change. It's not a static environment, but a patient one. The question of whether ancient life might still persist within this darkness remains open. Some researchers believe that deep brine pools, sealed off from circulation for millions of years, could harbour isolated microbial ecosystems. These pools, denser than the water around them, sit in depressions on the seafloor and rarely mix with the surrounding ocean. They're anoxic, saturated with salts, and sometimes enriched with metals. Yet even there, DNA evidence points to microbial activity. These are organisms that have existed in complete isolation, evolving along separate paths since long before humans appeared. Studying them might reveal forms of life so distinct that they could reshape our biological taxonomy. The more we learn about the ocean under the pole, the more it resembles an alien landscape. Darkness, pressure, and cold combine to create conditions unlike any familiar environment. Yet the systems that emerge are not chaotic. They are structured, interconnected and resilient. Nutrients circulate through microbial loops. Chemical gradients drive metabolism. Symbiotic relationships form between species that depend entirely on one another. It's a network sustained by balance, where every process supports another. This hidden stability offers clues about how ecosystems might function in places beyond Earth, in the subsurface oceans of icy moons, or the frozen crusts of distant planets. Even the sound of the ocean beneath the ice has its own distinct character. Hydrophones record low-frequency hums, clicks and groans that come from shifting ice, moving currents, and the faint activities of marine animals. These sounds travel for hundreds of kilometres, bouncing between the ice ceiling and the seafloor. To those who listen, the recordings resemble an orchestra of pressure and distance, slow, rhythmic and continuous. In that sense, the hidden ocean isn't silent. It speaks in vibrations rather than words, a language of physics and biology intertwined. While humans may never fully inhabit this environment, we're connected to it in ways both direct and subtle. The cold waters under the Arctic influence global ocean circulation, regulating climate patterns across the planet. The microbial processes that occur there affect carbon storage and nutrient cycles. The health of this unseen world is tied to the stability of the world above. When the surface ice melts, light penetrates deeper, changing temperature and chemistry below. New species move in, others retreat, and the entire system adjusts. The balance that has lasted for millennia is delicate, but it remains intact, for now. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of studying this ocean is realizing how much remains undiscovered. Every piece of data, every recovered sample suggests there's more complexity waiting to be found. The Arctic resists easy conclusions. Its mysteries expand with each answer. The more clearly we see its systems, the deeper the questions become. How long has life existed here uninterrupted? How much of Earth's evolutionary history is preserved beneath this ice? And if we were to lose it, through warming, through neglect, what stories would disappear with it, never to be recovered? For now, the hidden ocean beneath the pole continues its quiet existence. Currents move slowly, carrying nutrients through unseen corridors. Microbes drift in brine channels, forming patterns invisible to human eyes. Chemical reactions proceed one molecule at a time, indifferent to the passage of years. Above, the ice thickens, cracks and refreezes in endless rhythm. The connection between the two is constant. What happens to one echoes in the other, and as long as the ice remains, this ocean will keep its secrets, holding them in the dark, where time moves at the pace of water turning to stone. When scientists pull a long cylinder of ice from beneath the Arctic surface, they aren't just retrieving frozen water, they're retrieving memory. Each section, from the first clear layers near the top to the dense blue ones deep below, holds traces of moments long gone. It's a language of compression and silence, written over centuries by snow, wind and time. The farther the core extends downward, the further it travels backward through Earth's story. It's one of the few ways we can physically touch the past, a direct line between now and the world that existed before any human eyes looked north toward this ice. Reading that record isn't simple. The ice doesn't speak in sentences or symbols. It communicates through chemistry, through the ratios of isotopes, through the shapes and sizes of bubbles caught between crystals. A tiny change in one layer, a bit more dust, a hint of volcanic ash, a variation in trapped gas, can tell scientists about the temperature of the planet thousands of years ago. They can read the rhythm of the seasons, the rise and fall of greenhouse gases, the cycles of freezing and thawing that define the planet's pulse. In the Arctic, these signals are clearer than almost anywhere else. The cold protects them, slows decay, and keeps the information perfectly sealed. When a new core is brought to the surface, it's handled with the care reserved for something irreplaceable. The samples are transported in insulated containers, catalogued by depth and stored at temperatures cold enough to preserve their structure. Once in the lab, the analysis begins. Scientists slice the core into thin segments, often just a few centimeters each, representing decades of accumulation. They measure trapped gases using mass spectrometers, record trace elements with laser sensors, and examine the microstructure under microscopes capable of revealing the grain boundaries between crystals. Each technique translates a different aspect of the ice's language, and only by combining them can they build a coherent narrative. That narrative begins with snowfall. Every winter, snow falls over the Arctic Ocean, some of it from storms thousands of kilometers away. As it settles, it traps particles carried by winds, dust from deserts, salt from the sea, soot from volcanic eruptions, even spores and microorganisms drifting through the air. Each flake carries a signature of the atmosphere it formed in. When spring returns and the upper layer compresses, these traces are sealed beneath new snow, locking their information in place. Over time, as layer upon layer builds up, they compress into firn and eventually into solid ice. The deeper you go, the denser and older the ice becomes, until the air trapped inside is no longer air of the present, but of ancient times. Through this frozen record, scientists have reconstructed more than just climate. They've uncovered patterns of human activity extending back thousands of years. The concentration of certain pollutants in modern layers corresponds directly to industrial development. Traces of lead appear during the Roman era, decline during the Middle Ages, and rise again during the Industrial Revolution. Even the faint chemical fingerprints of nuclear testing in the mid-20th century can be found in Arctic cores. The ice records everything, indiscriminately, from natural changes in ocean currents to the brief flickers of human ambition. But within this record of chemistry lies something subtler: biological whispers, tiny fragments of DNA, bits of organic matter, and the remains of ancient microbes all appear in the layers. Most are broken down, inactive, but some are intact enough to be analysed. By sequencing their genetic material, researchers can identify what kinds of organisms once lived in the surrounding environment. They find traces of oceanic plankton, pollen from distant forests, and bacteria that drifted through the atmosphere long before the ice formed. Each discovery adds a new dimension to the story, showing that the Arctic is not an isolated archive but part of a global network of exchange. Dust from the Sahara, smoke from wildfires, and spores from mid-latitude forests all find their way into the snow. The ice becomes a collector of worlds. Sometimes, however, the story recorded in the ice isn't gradual, it's abrupt. In certain sections, layers thicken suddenly or contain unusual chemical spikes. These mark events that disrupted the planet's balance. Massive volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, or sudden climate reversals. In one well-known case, an ice core revealed a sharp increase in volcanic sulfate corresponding to the eruption of Iceland's Laki volcano in 1783. The data matched historical records describing a strange haze that darkened skies across Europe and Asia that year. Other cores have captured the faint chemical echoes of the asteroid impact that ended the age of the dinosaurs, preserved not as fossils but as an atmospheric memory. These moments remind us that the Arctic is not just a passive recorder of history, it's an active witness. Every flake of snow that lands on its surface carries information about conditions across the planet. And as that snow turns to ice, the record becomes permanent. The scientists who study these layers often describe a sense of intimacy when handling them. They can see, in the cross-section of a single core, the rhythm of ancient winters and summers. The bands alternate like the rings of a tree, pale and compacted where the snow was heavy, darker and porous where the weather was dry. Touching that pattern is like touching time itself. The bubbles within the ice hold special significance. Each one is a tiny sample of atmosphere, perfectly sealed until it's released in the lab. By analysing the gases inside, scientists can measure past concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and oxygen. These measurements form the foundation of our understanding of how climate has changed. They show, unmistakably, that the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today are higher than at any point in hundreds of thousands of years. The data from these bubbles is so precise that it has become a benchmark for global climate research. But it also tells us something less obvious, that the Earth's climate system is sensitive, interconnected, and prone to sudden shifts when balance is disturbed. Alongside the chemical data, there's another kind of information preserved, one that connects directly to life beneath the ice. Sometimes, within the air bubbles, scientists find traces of biological compounds, organic acids, fragments of cell walls, or proteins. These are the faint residues of organisms that once lived on or above the Arctic Ocean. In some cases, these traces can still respond to stimulation when the ice melts, showing that even after centuries or millennia, something inside remains viable. It's not quite alive in the conventional sense, but it's not fully dead either. It's a molecular echo that bridges the living and the inert. When researchers talk about the language of ice cores, they often describe it as multi-layered, like a symphony rather than a single melody. Temperature records, gas compositions, isotopic ratios, dust counts, microbial remnants, all these elements interact. No single piece makes sense on its own, but together they reveal a coherent rhythm. That rhythm shows patterns of warming and cooling that align with Earth's orbital cycles, the expansion and retreat of ice sheets, and the slow migration of species. It also shows how fragile those patterns can be. Even small disruptions, a volcanic eruption, a shift in ocean currents, a surge in greenhouse gases, can alter the tempo of the planet's climate for centuries. Each new core deepens the story. In Greenland, where ice extends for more than 3 kilometers, some cores reach back over 800,000 years. The Arctic Ocean's ice, being younger and thinner, preserves a more recent history, but one that's no less valuable. Together, these records allow scientists to trace connections between hemispheres, showing how events in one region influence conditions across the globe. A dust storm in Asia, for instance, might leave a signature that later appears in Arctic ice. A warm period in the southern hemisphere might correspond to a change in Arctic methane. It's an intricate web of cause and effect recorded molecule by molecule. Handling these cores requires discipline. Even a small change in temperature can alter their properties, so laboratories are kept at carefully controlled conditions. Researchers work in insulated suits, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Samples are cut, labelled and analysed with instruments sensitive enough to detect a single molecule in a trillion. The process is slow, sometimes tedious, but the rewards are profound. Every measurement contributes to a collective understanding of how the world works. Every discovery adds a layer to humanity's shared knowledge. Beyond the technical, there's an emotional dimension to this work. The scientists who devote their careers to studying ice often speak about the connection they feel to the material itself. To them, the cores are not just data, they're witnesses. They've endured eras of calm and upheaval, of ice ages and interglacials, carrying silent testimony to all of it. When a section of core fractures or melts, it's not merely a loss of information, it's the end of a chapter that can never be reread. That awareness gives their work a sense of urgency, especially now, as warming accelerates and ancient ice begins to vanish before it can be studied. The language of the cores is also evolving. With advancements in technology, scientists can now extract far more information from smaller samples than ever before. Techniques like metagenomics allow them to reconstruct entire microbial communities from minute fragments of DNA. Others use spectroscopy to identify molecular compounds associated with past biological activity. These methods reveal not only who lived in the Arctic, but what they were doing, how they metabolized, how they interacted, how they left chemical fingerprints in the ice. The story becomes richer, more detailed, and more connected to the broader web of life on Earth. Occasionally, cores reveal anomalies that spark debate. For instance, certain layers contain concentrations of methane higher than expected for their age, suggesting bursts of microbial activity under conditions that should have been too cold. Some researchers propose that these spikes reflect brief warming events that triggered microbial blooms beneath the ice. Others suggest the opposite, that microbial life itself produced greenhouse gases that contributed to those warm periods. Either way, the evidence points to a continuous interaction between life and climate, each shaping the other in a feedback loop that has persisted for millions of years. Even the smallest observations can lead to major insights. A change in the size of air bubbles might indicate faster ice formation. A shift in the ratio of isotopes might point to altered precipitation patterns. When thousands of such details are combined, they form a picture of a planet in motion, one that has never truly been static. The Arctic, far from being a frozen wasteland, emerges as a dynamic system, one that breathes, reacts, and remembers. The ice doesn't just record change, it participates in it, influencing temperature, reflectivity, and even ocean circulation. In the end, the ice cores tell a story both scientific and human. They remind us that understanding the past is essential to preparing for the future. They show that the patterns we see today, melting glaciers, rising seas, shifting climates, are not isolated events, but part of a long continuum. They also reveal the resilience of life, the way it adapts to cycles of cold and warmth, always finding a way to persist. The language of ice is subtle, and learning to read it requires patience. But once understood, it speaks volumes about the planet's endurance. The more we learn to interpret this frozen language, the more clearly we see our place within it. The data from the cores connects human activity to the natural rhythms of the world, showing that we are not separate observers but active participants. Each breath we take, each fire we light, adds another trace to the atmosphere that will one day be captured in snow and compressed into history. The ice will record it, just as it has recorded everything before. It will carry our story forward, silently, patiently, waiting for some future scientist to read the next chapter. And as long as the Arctic remains cold enough to preserve those layers, the planet will keep its memory intact. Each flake of snow, each frozen bubble, each trapped cell is part of a conversation that never ends. A dialogue between the world as it was and the world as it is. The language of ice is not written in words, but in the structure of water itself, in the way it changes state and still retains the past within its solid form. Listening to it requires humility, and maybe that's the point. The ice speaks slowly, and it expects us to do the same. When scientists speak about the mysteries of the Arctic, they often find themselves turning southward, to a place that mirrors it in silence and ice. Antarctica, the Earth's other frozen pole, is the closest thing the planet has to a twin in extremity. Yet for all their similarities, the two poles are profoundly different. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents, its ice floating and shifting with the currents. Antarctica is a continent surrounded by ocean, its ice sitting atop land that has not seen sunlight in millions of years. Together, they form a balance, one encircling water, one encased in rock, and between them lies the history of the planet's coldest, oldest systems. To understand what might lie beneath the Arctic's ice, scientists often look to Antarctica for clues, because in that deep, isolated landscape, they've already uncovered proof that life can endure the impossible. For most of modern history, the Antarctic interior was thought to be utterly lifeless. Temperatures plunge so low that steel fractures, winds carve the snow into frozen dunes, and the dryness rivals the surface of Mars. Yet beneath its glaciers, hidden under kilometres of ice, there are lakes, entire bodies of liquid water, sealed away for perhaps 20 million years. These subglacial lakes are among the most isolated environments on Earth, cut off from the atmosphere, sunlight, and any contact with the surface. Among them, one stands out, Lake Vostok. Discovered through radar imaging in the late 20th century, Lake Vostok lies buried beneath roughly 4 kilometres of ice. It's enormous, more than 250 kilometres long and nearly a kilometre deep, containing as much water as one of the Great Lakes. For decades, No one knew what was inside. It was assumed to be sterile, frozen in isolation. Then, when scientists finally managed to drill into the upper layers using specialized techniques to avoid contamination, they found something unexpected. Within samples of the lake water, trapped in the ice that had frozen against the overlying glacier, there were microorganisms, bacteria and archaea, some unlike anything previously catalogued. They weren't remnants. They were intact, potentially alive. The implications were enormous. It meant that life could persist in total darkness, under immense pressure, isolated for geological timescales. The environment inside Lake Vostok is unlike any other on Earth. Oxygen levels are far higher than at the surface, the pressure is immense, and the water is supersaturated with gases and minerals. Despite this, microbial DNA was found throughout the samples, representing hundreds of species, many of them adapted to metabolize chemicals rather than light. Some consume sulfur compounds, others use iron or ammonia. Together, they form a miniature biosphere, sustained entirely without sunlight. For researchers studying the Arctic, this discovery became a key to understanding what might exist beneath the ice at the top of the world. The Arctic Ocean, while more connected to the atmosphere than Antarctica's hidden lakes, shares many of the same conditions: low temperatures, isolation from sunlight, and long-term stability. If microbes can survive in Lake Vostok cut off for millions of years, then the layers of brine and sediment beneath the Arctic ice could harbour similar forms of life. Ancient, slow, and self-sufficient. The two poles may be opposites in geography, but biologically they speak the same language. The methods developed in Antarctica have become essential for Arctic research. The techniques for sterile drilling, sample collection, and contamination control used at Lake Vostok were refined through years of trial and error. Scientists learned how to penetrate ice without introducing surface microbes, how to preserve samples at extreme cold, and how to detect signs of life in minuscule quantities of material. These skills now guide expeditions in the Arctic, where researchers probe deep ice and subglacial sediments in search of microbial signatures. Each success in Antarctica becomes a rehearsal for exploration farther north and beyond Earth itself. The Antarctic experience also reshaped how scientists think about what defines habitability. Before Lake Vostok, it was assumed that liquid water, warmth and sunlight were prerequisites for sustaining ecosystems. The discovery of thriving microbial communities in near-freezing, oxygen-saturated, nutrient-poor water forced a reconsideration. Life didn't just tolerate these extremes, it flourished in them. That realization opened the door to imagining similar ecosystems beneath the Arctic and on icy worlds beyond. The comparison between Earth's poles became a bridge between planetary science and microbiology, between understanding our planet and searching for others like it. In the years following the initial discoveries, more subglacial lakes were found across Antarctica, hundreds of them, some large, some small, all sealed beneath kilometres of ice. Each one adds a piece to the puzzle. Lake Whillans, for instance, lies much closer to the surface than Vostok, and was accessed using hot water drilling. When samples were retrieved from its waters and sediments, scientists found active microbial communities. These weren't dormant or fossilised, they were metabolizing, processing carbon and sulfur, interacting in complex ways. They formed a functioning ecosystem completely isolated from sunlight. The conditions mirror, almost perfectly, those suspected beneath the Arctic's thickest ice. This realization has driven new hypotheses about the Arctic seabed. It's possible that beneath the permafrost, under layers of methane hydrate and frozen sediment, there are brine-filled pockets where microbial life still persists. These brines could act like the water in Lake Whillans, oxygen-poor but chemically rich, stable enough to allow metabolism at glacial pace. If such habitats exist, they could represent some of the oldest continuous ecosystems on the planet. The study of these analogues also extends into the realm of astrobiology. NASA and other space agencies have long viewed Antarctica as a model for extraterrestrial environments. The techniques used to explore its subglacial lakes are prototypes for missions to icy moons, such as Europa and Enceladus. Drills designed for Lake Vostok inspired the concept of cryobots, robotic probes capable of melting through ice to reach liquid water below. The microbial communities discovered there provide blueprints for what life on those moons might look like: small, slow-growing organisms living off chemical gradients instead of sunlight. When researchers turn their attention to the Arctic, they carry this framework with them, treating its hidden depths not just as part of Earth's biosphere, but as a window into what life anywhere might require. Antarctica also offers lessons about preservation. Because the ice there is thicker and colder, it protects its contents more effectively than the Arctic does. Biological material retrieved from Antarctic cores often dates back millions of years. In comparison, Arctic ice is younger and more dynamic, constantly moving and melting. That difference gives scientists two versions of the same story, one still in motion and one frozen in place. The comparison allows them to distinguish between what is unique to the Arctic and what belongs to the broader language of Earth's frozen regions. In both poles, the concept of isolation becomes central. Life in these environments develops without external input. It depends entirely on local chemistry and internal recycling. In Lake Vostok, for example, nutrients are replenished through the slow melting and refreezing of ice at the lake's boundaries. Microbes feed on compounds leaching from the bedrock and from the decomposition of their predecessors. The Arctic's sub-ice ecosystems may function similarly, drawing nutrients from sediments and the faint traces of organic material carried down from the surface. What emerges in both cases is a model of endurance built on self-sufficiency. When scientists compare samples from both regions, they notice similarities in microbial DNA sequences. Some lineages found in Antarctic lakes have close relatives in Arctic permafrost and sea ice. This raises intriguing questions about how these microorganisms spread. Did they share a common ancestor when the poles were more connected millions of years ago, before continental drift isolated them? Or did they evolve independently, converging on the same strategies for survival because the environment demanded it? The answer is still unclear, but the parallel evolution of similar adaptations, antifreeze proteins, pressure-resistant membranes, slow metabolic cycles, suggests that life, when faced with the same challenges, often finds the same solutions. The Antarctic also helps scientists understand the chemistry of the Arctic's buried waters. Analyses of Vostok and Whillans have revealed that their waters contain high concentrations of dissolved gases, including methane and nitrogen, and traces of minerals that suggest active geochemical reactions at the lake floor. These reactions likely provide energy sources for microbial communities, much like hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean. In the Arctic, where methane hydrates and subsea vents exist under the ice, similar processes may be fueling unseen ecosystems. The comparison gives researchers a template for where to look and what to expect. There's also a psychological dimension to working in such places. Scientists who have drilled into Antarctic ice describe a sense of quiet awe when they first retrieve samples from environments untouched for millions of years. It's not unlike the feeling of opening a sealed time capsule. The same feeling accompanies Arctic research, that awareness of being the first to touch something ancient, to release air or water that has been trapped since long before recorded history. Both regions evoke the same paradox. The more we uncover, the more we realise how little we've actually seen. Antarctica's example also serves as a warning. Its lakes are pristine precisely because they were untouched. Once opened, even with the greatest care, they risk contamination. Researchers learned this lesson the hard way during early drilling attempts, when traces of human-associated microbes were found in samples. This realization led to stricter protocols, new sterile techniques, and international agreements about how to explore these environments responsibly. Those same precautions now guide Arctic missions. As melting accelerates and access increases, Scientists must balance discovery with protection, ensuring that what they find remains as undisturbed as possible. Perhaps the most profound connection between the two poles lies not in their biology, but in what they reveal about time. Both regions operate on scales far beyond human experience. A lake sealed for 20 million years, an ice core recording atmospheric shifts over hundreds of thousands. These timescales dwarf our sense of history. They remind us that life and climate move in long rhythms, measured in glacial pulses rather than generations. The microbes in those lakes and under the Arctic ice don't hurry. They live according to a tempo set by the planet itself. To study them is to step briefly into that slower, steadier world. Even the act of exploration links the poles. Many of the same researchers who drill in Antarctica also work in the Arctic, carrying methods and perspectives between the two. They refer to them as reflections, opposite mirrors showing different aspects of the same phenomenon. The knowledge flows both ways. Observations of Arctic sea ice dynamics inform understanding of Antarctic glaciers, and discoveries in Antarctic lakes guide Arctic sampling strategies. Together, they form a global picture of how ice, water, and life interact. As technology advances, these connections become clearer. Satellites now track ice thickness, movement, and temperature across both hemispheres in real time. Autonomous underwater vehicles can navigate beneath the ice for weeks, mapping regions that were once unreachable. Drones monitor meltwater patterns, while deep ice observatories measure temperature and chemical gradients continuously. This network of observation links the poles like a single system, a planetary circulatory loop of data and understanding. The clues from Antarctica's twin are not merely scientific, they carry philosophical weight. They show that isolation doesn't mean emptiness, that silence doesn't imply stillness. They prove that life adapts to constraints we once thought absolute. And they remind us that our planet, though divided by oceans and hemispheres, functions as one continuous whole. The Arctic and Antarctic are not opposites, but partners in the same long experiment of endurance. One reflects what the other hides, one teaches what the other confirms. Every year, as research stations on both ends of the planet send their findings back to the rest of the world, the narrative of ice grows richer. The data from Antarctica informs Arctic models, and Arctic measurements refine our understanding of Antarctic systems. The flow of information mirrors the flow of water beneath the ice, steady, slow, and essential. Each discovery at one pole illuminates the mysteries of the other, building a bridge of knowledge across the planet's axis. And while the two regions may never meet, their stories converge. The microbes sealed beneath them speak of persistence. The ice itself speaks of patience. Between them lies the understanding that life, once begun, finds ways to continue, no matter how long the night or how thick the ice above. When scientists study the Arctic and Antarctic, they aren't only looking at Earth. They're also looking outward, to places where sunlight barely reaches, and where ice, not rock or soil, defines the landscape. What they learn at the poles becomes a guide for exploring worlds far beyond our own. In the frozen oceans beneath those distant surfaces, they see the possibility that life might not be confined to Earth at all. The clues we gather from the ice here help decode the mysteries of places where no human has yet set foot. Moons that circle giant planets, icy asteroids drifting through the dark, and dwarf worlds at the edge of our solar system. Among the most compelling of these worlds is Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. From a distance, it looks like a smooth white sphere crossed by dark cracks, but beneath that icy crust lies something extraordinary, an ocean. Not a small one, but a global body of water deeper than any on Earth, locked beneath tens of kilometers of ice. Scientists estimate that Europa's ocean contains more liquid water than all of Earth's combined. The discovery was made through a combination of gravitational measurements and magnetic field data collected by the Galileo spacecraft in the 1990s. The evidence was clear. Beneath the surface, something conductive, almost certainly salt water, was moving. It wasn't frozen solid, it was dynamic, and that meant potential. The parallels with the Arctic were immediate. Both environments feature thick ice, constant cold, and darkness broken only by faint reflections of light. Beneath both, there's water kept liquid by forces we can't see, geothermal energy on Earth, tidal heating on Europa. And in both, chemistry plays the central role in sustaining what little warmth and movement exist. When scientists study microbial life in Arctic brine channels or the sealed waters of Lake Vostok, they're effectively studying models of what might exist on Europa. The metabolic pathways that let microbes survive without sunlight, using sulfur, iron, or methane instead of photosynthesis, could function in similar ways beneath Europa's crust. In the years since those discoveries, missions to study icy moons have multiplied. Enceladus, a smaller moon orbiting Saturn, revealed itself as another candidate for subsurface life when the Cassini spacecraft captured images of geysers erupting from its south pole. The plumes, shooting hundreds of kilometers into space, were found to contain water vapor, ice particles, salts, and organic molecules. It was as though the moon was leaking hints of its ocean directly into the vacuum of space. That finding changed the conversation about where to look for life. For the first time, it seemed possible that sampling another world's ocean might not require drilling through kilometers of ice. The material was already there, spraying outward for anyone prepared to catch it. To scientists who've spent decades studying Earth's frozen regions, those plumes looked familiar. They resembled the vents that form where Arctic sea ice cracks, releasing plumes of water vapor and gases into the air. The resemblance is superficial, of course. The scales and energies involved are vastly different, but the principle is the same. Pressure builds below an icy crust, and when it finds a weak point, the result is an eruption of gas and water. On Earth, such events are part of the normal exchange between the ocean and atmosphere. On Enceladus, they may be the only visible evidence of life's potential. Within the plumes, scientists detected simple organic compounds, molecules that, on Earth, form the basis of cells. It wasn't proof of life, but it was a sign that the ingredients were present and that the chemistry necessary for biology was underway. Back on Earth, researchers continue to use Arctic and Antarctic systems as analogues for these distant worlds. Under the ice near the North Pole, conditions can reach -2 degrees Celsius, total darkness, and near complete isolation from the surface. The microbes that persist there metabolize slowly, feeding on trace chemicals. Experiments show that many of them could survive in simulated extraterrestrial environments, low temperature, high pressure, no sunlight. Some can even endure radiation exposure similar to what they'd face on a moon like Europa. In essence, the Arctic doubles as a natural training ground for understanding how life endures beyond Earth. The similarities go beyond biology. In both Earth's polar oceans and the icy moons of the outer solar system, ice plays the role of both shield and enabler. It isolates the water beneath from harsh external conditions, but it also stabilizes it, preventing complete freezing. The ice acts as a barrier against radiation while maintaining internal pressure that allows liquid to persist. In this way, ice becomes a habitat rather than an obstacle. The same principle could apply on countless other worlds, meaning that where there is ice, there may be water, and where there is water, there may be life. To understand how this might work, scientists have turned to analog experiments in Earth's coldest places. In Greenland, teams have drilled through 2 kilometers of ice to reach subglacial lakes, testing equipment that could one day be used on Europa. These drills are designed to operate autonomously, melting their way downward while analysing the ice around them for chemical and biological signatures. The process is slow, requiring precision and patience, but every step replicates the challenges that space missions will face: temperature fluctuations, mechanical stress, contamination control. All of it must be perfected here before it's attempted elsewhere. The Arctic, with its unpredictable weather and shifting ice, is the ideal proving ground. One of the most interesting lessons to emerge from these studies is that the boundary between ice and water, the interface just beneath the frozen surface, is often the most biologically active zone. In that thin layer, temperature and salinity fluctuate enough to create microcurrents. Nutrients concentrate there, and organisms exploit it as a refuge. It's possible that similar interfaces exist on Europa or Enceladus, regions where the ice above meets the liquid below, forming habitats rich in chemical energy. If life exists in those oceans, that's likely where it would be found. Even beyond our solar system, the same logic holds. Astronomers have identified thousands of exoplanets orbiting distant stars, and among them are many icy worlds, some far from their suns, others orbiting dim red dwarfs. For these planets, internal heat generated by tidal forces or radioactive decay might sustain subsurface oceans. The physics is universal. If conditions on Europa or Enceladus can maintain liquid water, then similar processes could be at work elsewhere. What makes the Arctic and Antarctic so valuable is that they give us a tangible example, a piece of the puzzle we can touch and measure. The connection between planetary science and polar research has become so strong that teams now collaborate across disciplines. Glaciologists, microbiologists, planetary geologists and engineers work together to design missions that combine insights from both fields. The upcoming Europa Clipper mission, for example, draws directly on techniques developed in Earth's ice-covered lakes. Instruments designed to detect biological molecules in space are tested first in Arctic brine channels. Each discovery made here, no matter how small, contributes to the larger question of whether life is unique to Earth or a common outcome of planetary evolution. There's a quiet shift in perspective that comes from these studies. For most of human history, we looked outward and saw the icy moons and planets as symbols of desolation. They were the cold, dead parts of the cosmos, reminders of how rare warmth and life must be. Now, as we study our own frozen regions more closely, that perception changes. We begin to see those distant worlds not as dead, but as dormant, places where life could be hidden, slowed to a near standstill, just as microbes are beneath the Arctic. The same mechanisms that preserve life here might be operating there, waiting for the right moment, the right temperature to stir again. The connection also changes how we think about fragility. The Arctic and Antarctic are delicate systems, finely balanced between freezing and melting, isolation and exposure. A small change in temperature can trigger cascading effects. If similar systems exist elsewhere, they would likely share that vulnerability. Life that depends on such balance would be sensitive to even minor shifts. In that sense, the study of frozen worlds is not just about discovering life, but about understanding what keeps it stable. It teaches us how to recognize the thin boundaries that sustain existence, both here and across the cosmos. Scientists often describe the first time they see data from an under-ice environment as humbling. The images are dim and colourless, but the implications are vast. They show that even in darkness, structure and movement persist. That's the same feeling they expect to experience when the first detailed images from Europa or Enceladus arrive. The anticipation is not of spectacle, but of subtlety. A faint chemical signature, a microscopic pattern, a trace of carbon in ice. The evidence of life, if it exists, may be small and easily overlooked. But after decades of studying Earth's polar regions, scientists have learned that small things can hold the largest truths. Beyond scientific parallels, there's a deeper reflection at play. The study of frozen worlds invites a re-evaluation of what life requires. It challenges the assumption that warmth and sunlight are the only sources of vitality. It shows that energy can flow through chemistry alone, that ecosystems can thrive in near silence, and that endurance can replace abundance as the measure of vitality. This understanding changes the way we look at the cosmos, not as mostly empty, but as potentially filled with hidden reservoirs of life, waiting under layers of ice. In laboratories around the world, experiments continue. Samples from Arctic permafrost are subjected to simulated extraterrestrial conditions. lower gravity, higher radiation, colder temperatures. Many of the microbes survive, some even adapting to the stress. Their resilience becomes a form of evidence in itself. If life can persist here, it can persist elsewhere. The same structures that protect a bacterium in Arctic ice could protect it on a moon or asteroid. The lesson is simple, but profound. Life doesn't need perfect conditions, just consistent ones. The parallels extend beyond biology into the emotional realm of exploration. The researchers who spend months on the ice describe the same sensations astronauts report in space: isolation, vastness, a sense of distance from the familiar. The view stretches endlessly, the silence feels absolute, and every sound, a crack in the ice, a gust of wind, feels amplified by emptiness. In those moments, it's easy to imagine what it might be like to stand on Europa's surface, looking out over a plain of frozen ridges beneath a dim sun. The feeling of being at the edge of the known world is the same, whether it's in the Arctic or 1 billion kilometers away. Every discovery in our own frozen regions adds a small piece to the larger cosmic map. When scientists find microbes surviving without sunlight or chemical systems operating at sub-zero temperatures, they expand the definition of habitability. They make it more inclusive, less Earth-centered, and in doing so, they bring distant possibilities closer. The Arctic becomes not just a place of study, but a bridge, a link between the world we inhabit and the ones we hope to understand. It's easy to think of these frozen worlds as separate, but they are connected by physics, chemistry, and the shared rules of matter. The same water that flows beneath Arctic ice is made of the same molecules found on Europa. The same carbon that forms microbes here exists in dust clouds across the galaxy. Studying the Arctic in a way is studying the universe, through a single, cold lens that happens to sit at our planet's top. The lessons it offers extend outward, telling us that life, once formed, tends to persist wherever it can, no matter how deep the dark or how slow the clock. In the years to come, when the next generation of spacecraft reaches those distant moons, the data they send back will likely echo what we've already learned here. That beneath layers of ice there are systems of order, chemistry, and perhaps biology. That the silence of frozen water does not mean absence, but patience. And that in the coldest, most distant corners of existence, the same principles that sustain life beneath the Arctic may still be at work, shaping the hidden oceans of worlds beyond our own. In the frozen north, there are places where the ground exhales. It doesn't happen with sound or heat, but with faint invisible streams of gas rising through cracks in the permafrost and bubbles beneath the ice. Most people would never notice it unless they looked closely. Yet those who study the Arctic see it as one of the most telling phenomena on Earth, a breath from the deep past, released molecule by molecule. The gas is methane, a simple compound of carbon and hydrogen, but its presence tells a complex story. It comes from countless small reactions, from buried organic matter, from trapped sediments, from frozen wetlands, and perhaps from something more elusive, the long silent activity of ancient microbes awakening as the world warms. Methane is an important clue in the study of ancient life. It doesn't last long in the atmosphere, so when scientists detect it in measurable quantities, it usually means that something nearby is still producing it. On Earth, much of that production is biological. Microbes known as methanogens create it as part of their metabolism, using hydrogen and carbon dioxide to generate energy. These organisms live in oxygen-free environments, wetlands, sediments, the guts of animals, and the deep permafrost beneath the Arctic tundra. For thousands of years, their activity was slowed or halted by cold, but as temperatures rise and frozen layers begin to thaw, those microbes find themselves returning to conditions where they can function again. The result is a slow, steady release of methane, a signal that the biological past is reconnecting with the present. To understand what's happening, Scientists study methane emissions from permafrost in detail. They measure concentrations of the gas at different depths, analyse isotopic ratios, and compare them to known biological and geological signatures. Biological methane has a distinctive fingerprint, a particular balance of carbon isotopes that differs from that produced by purely chemical reactions. In many Arctic regions, those biological ratios dominate, suggesting that the gas isn't just seeping from ancient geological deposits, but is being generated anew by microbes that survived the freeze. They are, in a literal sense, breathing again after thousands of years of near silence. The process is subtle. Deep within the frozen soil, organic material, leaves, roots, animal remains, has been preserved for millennia. When thawing begins, water seeps in, creating small, oxygen-poor pockets where anaerobic microbes thrive. They feed on the carbon-rich matter, producing methane as waste. Some of it stays trapped in the soil, forming bubbles that distort the surface. Some escapes through fissures, rising into the air. Scientists drilling into these layers sometimes find pockets so concentrated that they hiss softly when punctured. Each bubble is a capsule of history, containing gases last circulated when mammoths grazed the tundra. The scale of these emissions is difficult to grasp. Permafrost covers nearly a quarter of the landmass in the Northern Hemisphere, and vast portions of it contain frozen carbon stores. Estimates suggest that if even a fraction were to thaw, the methane released could have significant effects on global temperatures. But for many researchers, the climate implications are only part of the story. The other part is biological, the chance to study how ancient microbial ecosystems reawaken, and what they reveal about life's persistence. These microbes are survivors from a world long gone, carrying genetic adaptations tuned to extremes of cold and isolation. By examining them, scientists glimpse evolutionary strategies that may date back to the earliest forms of metabolism on Earth. The study of these systems often begins with field expeditions to the tundra. Researchers travel to remote regions, sometimes accessible only by helicopter, and drill into the permafrost to extract cores. Each sample is carefully sealed to prevent contamination and brought to cold laboratories where temperatures mimic the natural environment. Once thawed under controlled conditions, the cores are examined for gases, microbial activity and chemical composition. Under microscopes, scientists can see cells beginning to move, their metabolic reactions resuming as if no time had passed. The sight is ordinary, just a few shifting specks, but the meaning is profound. Life that was effectively paused for tens of thousands of years resumes with the first hint of warmth. Not all methane in the Arctic is biological, of course. Some originates from deep geological sources, trapped beneath sediments for millions of years. The boundary between these sources is complex, and distinguishing them requires detailed isotopic analysis. But in many areas, particularly in regions of thawing permafrost and shallow seabeds, microbial activity is clearly a major contributor. The gas itself becomes a record of life's endurance, its isotopic ratios carrying the faint signature of metabolism from a time when the landscape looked entirely different. It's like decoding a chemical message left behind by organisms that never expected it to be read. One of the most striking examples of this phenomenon occurs along the Arctic Ocean's continental shelves. There, beneath a relatively thin layer of ice and sediment, methane seeps continuously from the seabed. Some of it escapes into the water column, where it dissolves or is consumed by microbes. These methane-eating bacteria form dense communities that thrive precisely where the gas emerges, converting it into carbon dioxide and organic matter. They act as biological filters, preventing much of the methane from reaching the atmosphere. Without them, emissions would likely be far higher. Their activity demonstrates another form of balance, one that links geological processes to living systems in a feedback loop of chemistry and biology. In these undersea environments, researchers have discovered microbial mats that stretch across the sediments like thin films. They are made up of layers of bacteria and archaea, each with a specific role in processing the chemical gradients around them. Some oxidize methane, others reduce sulfate. Together, they create self-sustaining cycles that recycle energy without sunlight. These systems operate in the dark at near freezing temperatures, fueled entirely by the chemical energy stored in the gas itself. They are modern analogues of some of Earth's earliest ecosystems, showing how life can build complexity from simplicity. Studying them isn't easy. Sampling from the seabed requires remotely operated vehicles that can maneuver beneath the ice, collect sediments, and return them to research vessels without warming or contamination. Even then, much of what happens within those microbial mats remains invisible. The interactions between species occur at scales smaller than a grain of sand, yet their collective impact can alter the chemistry of entire regions. Each community functions like an unseen engine, converting one form of carbon into another, balancing the exchange between Earth crust, ocean, and atmosphere. The term ghosts of microbes sometimes appears in the literature to describe remnants of these processes, molecular traces left behind by organisms long gone. These can take the form of lipids, cell wall fragments, or distinctive chemical isotopes embedded in sediments. Even when the cells themselves have vanished, their chemical fingerprints remain, marking where they once existed. Scientists analysing Arctic cores often find such markers, preserved through freeze and thaw cycles. They offer evidence that life has occupied these environments repeatedly across geological time, retreating during colder periods and re-emerging when conditions allowed. The continuity is astonishing, a silent record of persistence written not in fossils but in molecules. These chemical remnants are not just of academic interest. They help refine models of Earth's carbon cycle, showing how biological and geological processes have interacted over millions of years. Methane, in particular, plays a crucial role in regulating temperature. Too much, and the planet warms rapidly. Too little, and it cools. Microbes act as both source and sink, producing methane in some environments and consuming it in others. The balance between these opposing processes has shaped Earth's climate throughout its history. Understanding that balance in the Arctic today offers clues about how it might shift in the future. The study of methane emissions also intersects with the search for life beyond Earth. When telescopes detect methane in the atmospheres of distant planets, scientists immediately ask whether it could be a sign of biology. On Mars, for instance, fluctuating methane levels have been observed, sparking debates about whether they result from chemical reactions in the rock or microbial activity underground. By examining how methane behaves in Arctic and Antarctic systems, how it's produced, stored, and released, researchers develop frameworks for interpreting those distant signals. The Arctic, in this way, becomes a reference point for understanding alien biosignatures. Closer to home, the reawakening of ancient microbes raises questions about resilience and risk. Some scientists wonder whether thawing permafrost could release pathogens frozen since prehistoric times. While most microbes found so far are harmless, a few viruses have proven capable of infecting modern hosts. In controlled experiments, giant viruses recovered from Siberian permafrost were reactivated after more than 30,000 years of dormancy, infecting amoebas but not humans. Still, the finding serves as a reminder that the frozen world is not inert. It holds active potential, biological and chemical, waiting for conditions to shift. For those who work in these regions, the experience of witnessing this process firsthand is difficult to describe. Standing on the tundra, watching the ground bubble as methane escapes through thin ice, one becomes aware of time in a different way. Each bubble represents centuries of slow accumulation, released in an instant. The air above carries not just gas, but memory, a connection to life forms that lived and died before humans arrived. The landscape becomes a breathing archive, exhaling its past into the present. The data collected from these sites often reveal unexpected patterns. In some areas, emissions peak not during the warmest months but during freeze-up, when the ground contracts and cracks form, allowing trapped gases to escape. In others, microbial activity continues under snow cover, insulated by the very layer that seems to silence it. These details matter because they show that the Arctic's response to warming is not uniform or predictable. It's a mosaic of feedbacks, each governed by the chemistry and biology of specific microenvironments. Back in laboratories, researchers use these data to model future scenarios. They simulate permafrost thaw, microbial activation, and gas flux, combining physical and biological variables. The results vary, but all point to one conclusion. The processes beneath the ice are active, dynamic, and capable of influencing global systems. Yet within that conclusion lies a more subtle insight, that the story of methane in the Arctic is not just about climate or chemistry. It's about endurance, transformation, and the blurred boundary between life and matter. Even as the Arctic changes, the microbes responsible for these emissions continue their cycles. Some die as conditions shift, others adapt or migrate deeper. New communities emerge, built from both ancient and modern lineages. Their interactions shape the chemistry of the soil, the composition of the air, and the future of the planet's climate. The breath of methane, then, becomes a symbol of continuity, the voice of a biosphere that has never truly gone silent, only changed its tone. The ghosts of microbes linger in every sample, every gas pocket, every frozen core. They remind us that the line between the living and the non-living is thinner than we imagine. Molecules can outlast their makers. Chemistry can preserve memory. What we call dead matter often still carries the structure of life, waiting for warmth or time to make it move again. The Arctic is full of such thresholds, places where the ancient and the modern overlap, where the present breathes the remnants of the past. And so, the study continues. Scientists return each year to measure, to sample, to listen to the slow exhalation of the ground. They track changes in gas concentrations, monitor microbial DNA, and refine their understanding of how the frozen Earth breathes. Every new data set adds a layer to the narrative, linking the biology of today to the geology of yesterday. The more they learn, the clearer it becomes that the Arctic is not a static archive, but an active participant in the planet's ongoing story. A vast cold engine where even the smallest organisms contribute to the rhythm of change. Ice is not alive, yet it has a kind of memory. It records without judgment, keeping the impressions of everything that touches it. Snow falls, compresses, freezes, and with each layer, another page is written into the planet's archive. The Arctic holds millions of these pages stacked in silence. Every season adds a thin layer of data, a record of wind, dust, salt, gases, and the faint traces of life. Unlike rock or soil, ice preserves with extraordinary precision. It doesn't erode easily, and the cold prevents decay. In that sense, the Arctic is not just a place but a library, and the ice is its most patient librarian. When scientists extract cores from deep beneath the surface, they're reading that library line by line. The upper layers tell of recent centuries, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of greenhouse gases, the traces of nuclear tests. Below those lie the records of earlier climates, before factories and cities existed, when mammoths roamed the tundra and the planet's rhythms were guided only by the tilt of its axis and the path of its orbit. In those layers, the composition of gases and isotopes reveals ancient temperatures, ocean circulation patterns, and atmospheric shifts. But beyond climate, the ice also stores biology, the subtle fingerprints of organisms that lived and died long before our time. In tiny air bubbles sealed within the ice, scientists have found DNA fragments, bacterial spores, and even viruses. Some are still intact, others degraded, but all carry information. They come from dust blown across continents, from sea spray, from microscopic algae frozen in place. Each is a small remnant of an ecosystem that no longer exists. Collectively, they show that life has touched every part of the planet, even the most remote and frozen. The ice doesn't discriminate. It captures whatever passes through the air, the living, the inert, the invisible, and keeps it, preserving moments in a timeline that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. This property of preservation makes ice one of the most valuable scientific materials on Earth. It allows us to study not only the atmosphere of the past, but the genetic diversity of ancient life. By analysing DNA fragments from different depths, researchers can track changes in microbial populations over time. They can see when certain species flourished, when others declined, and how ecosystems responded to major climate shifts. In some cores, they've even identified transitions that align with known events in Earth's history: volcanic eruptions, shifts in ocean currents, or abrupt warming periods. The ice holds not just the conditions of those events, but the biological reactions to them. What makes this record even more remarkable is its completeness. Most archives are selective. They preserve some aspects of history and lose others. Ice, by contrast, captures nearly everything that enters its reach. The chemical composition of each layer reflects global circulation patterns. A storm in Asia, a fire in North America, a dust storm in Africa, all leave traces that eventually settle into Arctic snow. When those traces are found in ice cores, they connect distant regions through shared evidence. The Arctic becomes a global witness, silently documenting the interplay between continents, oceans, and atmosphere. There's a quiet irony in how the ice preserves what the world above constantly forgets. Human civilization measures time in short spans, decades, maybe centuries. Ice measures in millennia. While cultures rise and vanish, while cities are built and abandoned, the Arctic continues to accumulate its record without pause. It remembers events we never recorded, climates no one witnessed, species that evolved and disappeared before memory existed. Its pages extend beyond history into prehistory, beyond what we can recall into what the planet itself still knows. In some ways, the ice's memory isn't passive. Over time, pressure changes its structure. Molecules shift, layers merge, and gases move slightly between bubbles. These alterations, though small, provide clues about how matter behaves under extreme conditions. Scientists can trace how long it takes for air to migrate through compacted snow, or how certain isotopes diffuse, altering chemical ratios. These processes reveal how dynamic frozen systems truly are. The ice doesn't just store, it slowly processes its own data. Even in stillness, it changes, like a living archive that organizes itself over eons. When the ice melts, those stored memories are released. The gases escape into the air, the microbes and particles re-enter circulation, and what was once hidden becomes part of the present again. This release can have physical consequences, contributing to warming or altering local ecosystems, but it also carries symbolic weight. The past, long contained, begins to interact with the modern world. The Earth's own memory leaks into its current story, influencing it in ways both subtle and measurable. Scientists sometimes describe this process as the unsealing of climate history. The planet, through melting ice, is revealing what it once was, and in doing so, changing what it is becoming. This concept extends to the microbial life within the ice. Some organisms remain viable even after millennia of entrapment. When thawed, they can resume metabolism, divide, and grow. These revivals are not dramatic but quiet, a few cells at a time rejoining the flow of biology after centuries of suspension. To see this happen under a microscope is to witness continuity in its purest form. There's no awareness, no memory in the human sense, but there is persistence. The cells carry genetic instructions unbroken since their origin. In that way, the ice's biological memory operates alongside its chemical one, maintaining life's blueprint across vast stretches of time. Certain microbes found in ancient ice possess unique adaptations that make this possible. Their proteins remain stable at low temperatures. Their DNA repair systems function even after long dormancy, and their membranes resist damage from freezing and thawing. Studying these mechanisms helps scientists understand not just how life survives cold, but how it resists time itself. The same resilience could apply in other contexts: the deep ocean, underground caverns, even extraterrestrial environments. The ice, then, becomes more than an archive. It becomes a manual on how life endures in the face of entropy. The memory contained in ice also extends to events we can scarcely imagine. Within the layers are traces of ancient forest fires, volcanic eruptions and cosmic impacts. Ash particles, soot and exotic isotopes tell of moments when the planet's balance was violently disrupted. In one core, scientists found evidence of a massive solar storm that struck Earth thousands of years ago, leaving behind increased levels of certain isotopes. In another, they identified dust from a volcanic eruption that darkened skies across hemispheres. Each discovery links the present to those distant catastrophes, showing how global systems react and recover. Some of the most delicate information preserved in ice comes from the air itself. The bubbles within deep cores hold samples of ancient atmospheres, trapped when the snow first compacted. Analysing them allows scientists to measure past levels of carbon dioxide and methane with extraordinary accuracy. These measurements form the backbone of our understanding of climate change. They show the natural cycles of greenhouse gases over hundreds of thousands of years and make clear how sharply current levels exceed anything in that history. The ice remembers what stable balance once looked like, even as that balance now shifts. In this sense, the ice functions as both teacher and warning. It provides a long-term perspective that human timescales cannot match. The variations it records show that the planet's climate has always changed, but usually slowly, over tens of millennia. The rapid rise in temperature and greenhouse gases in the past century stands out sharply against that background. It's not an interpretation, it's a measurement. The ice, in its impartial way, shows the difference between natural fluctuation and human acceleration. It doesn't accuse or comfort, it simply records. Beyond data, there's something almost personal about the idea that the ice remembers everything. It means that nothing on this planet truly disappears. The molecules of air we breathe today may once have been trapped in ancient bubbles. The snow falling now will one day be compacted into new layers, carrying traces of our era. The chemicals we emit, the dust from our industries, even microscopic fragments of plastic. Future scientists, if they exist, will read those signals as we now read the past. The record will continue, unbroken, through whatever changes come. The physical structure of ice contributes to its reliability as a memory medium. Each crystal forms around a nucleus, a particle of dust, a salt grain, or sometimes a microorganism. As more water molecules join, the crystal grows, trapping that nucleus within its lattice. Over time, billions of these crystals fuse together, forming a dense mass with countless internal records. The pattern of those crystals, visible under polarized light, reveals the history of stress and flow within the glacier. Bands of compressed and stretched grains show how the ice has moved, bent, and shifted. The material remembers not just composition, but motion. When glaciers flow toward the sea, they carry that memory with them. Eventually chunks break off and drift as icebergs, carrying within them trapped air and ancient life. As they melt, they release those contents into the ocean, dispersing them into new cycles. In this way, the ice's memory doesn't stay confined. It re-enters circulation, influencing ocean chemistry, feeding plankton with nutrients, and altering local ecosystems. The past literally dissolves into the present, shaping it molecule by molecule. There's a growing recognition among scientists that studying this process requires more than technical expertise. It demands a sense of patience and perspective. The work of drilling, preserving, and analysing ice cores often spans decades. The same core may be studied by multiple generations of researchers, each adding new insights as technology advances. In that sense, the scientific community itself becomes part of the ice's memory, an ongoing chain of observation that mirrors the continuity they study. In recent years, the accelerating loss of polar ice has added urgency to this work. Glaciers that have preserved their records for tens of thousands of years are now melting at unprecedented rates. Once they vanish, their information is gone forever. Scientists race to collect cores from vulnerable regions, storing them in archives around the world, a global effort to preserve the memory of Earth before it melts away. The irony is unavoidable. To study the ice that remembers everything, we must act before that memory disappears. Still, even as the surface changes, deeper layers remain untouched. There are regions where the ice is kilometers thick, cold enough to remain stable for millennia more. Beneath those depths, the archive continues to grow, each snowfall adding another fraction of a millimeter to the record. The planet keeps writing quietly, in the same slow script it has always used. What we read now is only a small portion of what exists, a few selected chapters from a story that stretches backward far beyond our reach. And while humans measure, map, and analyse, the ice continues its own work, holding on to what we cannot, storing every particle, every trace, every whisper of the world that created it. It is the most honest of witnesses, impartial, enduring, incapable of forgetting. Whatever happens above, the ice below will remember. The people who dedicate their lives to the study of ice rarely describe their work in grand terms. Most speak quietly, using simple language to describe what they do, drilling, sampling, measuring, recording. Yet what they're really doing is listening. They listen to the sounds of cores being extracted from deep beneath glaciers, to the crackle of frozen air bubbles escaping when ancient ice warms, to the faint hiss of methane released from thawing permafrost. They listen to the language of pressure and temperature, of slow movement and long silence. The scientists who listen to ice are translators of the planet's memory, working in some of the harshest environments on Earth to understand what it's trying to say. Their work begins long before they set foot on the ice. Months, sometimes years, of preparation go into a single expedition. Equipment must be tested in cold chambers, transportation arranged for remote areas, and every variable accounted for. Failure is costly, not just financially but in terms of opportunity. The Arctic gives small windows of access. In summer, melting makes travel possible but threatens stability. In winter, conditions are stable but brutally cold, with darkness lasting for weeks. The timing of each mission is a balance between safety and science, between the need to collect samples and the need to survive. When the teams arrive, they find themselves in a landscape that defies familiarity. There are no roads, no constant landmarks, only shifting snow and ice that seem to erase footprints as soon as they're made. The air feels dry and sharp, carrying sound farther than expected, yet swallowing it just as quickly. Machinery hums against the wind, creating a rhythm that becomes strangely comforting over time. Communication with the outside world is limited, often restricted to brief radio transmissions or satellite messages. In that isolation, researchers form small, close communities, bound by shared purpose and the awareness that they're part of something larger than themselves. Each expedition has its own routine. The days begin early, though daylight has little meaning near the poles. Some scientists monitor instruments, recording temperature, humidity, and gas concentrations. Others prepare drills or maintain generators. The work is methodical and repetitive, requiring precision in conditions that punish mistakes. Simple tasks, tightening a bolt, sealing a container, must be done with thick gloves and limited dexterity. Frost forms on every surface. Metal tools stick to exposed skin. Every movement carries a cost in energy. Yet within that constant discomfort, there's also focus. The isolation strips away distractions, leaving only the task at hand. When the drilling begins, the process moves slowly. Each metre of ice takes hours to cut through. The cores come up in segments, long cylindrical sections that glisten under the pale light. They're immediately catalogued, measured, and sealed in protective sleeves. The scientists treat them with the same care given to artifacts or fragile manuscripts. To damage a sample would be to erase a piece of irreplaceable history. Once extracted, the cores are stored in insulated boxes kept at sub-zero temperatures until they can be shipped to laboratories. Every label, every note must be precise. Later, when the samples are analysed, that accuracy determines whether the data will make sense. Some of the most demanding work takes place not during the drilling, but in the waiting. Weather delays can last for days or weeks. Blizzards halt movement, storms ground flights, and mechanical failures can trap teams in temporary camps. During those times, the scientists retreat to their shelters, small heated tents or modular stations, and occupy themselves with maintenance, calibration, or simply reading and writing. The constant hum of generators fills the background, a steady reminder of dependence on fragile systems. In those moments, the line between the individual and the environment becomes clear. The ice allows them to stay only as long as it wants to. Many of these researchers have spent decades returning to the same sites, tracking changes year after year. They've seen glaciers retreat, melt ponds expand, and ice sheets fracture. Some describe a sense of loss, the realization that the landscapes they study are vanishing even as they record them, but they also speak of responsibility. Their data provides the foundation for understanding how the planet is changing. Without those measurements, there would be no way to trace the connections between carbon levels, sea temperatures, and atmospheric shifts. Their work transforms the intangible, wind, heat, light, into numbers that can be analysed and compared. It turns the slow language of nature into information that humanity can interpret. The idea of listening to ice extends beyond the metaphorical. In many cases, scientists literally record its sounds. Sensitive instruments, called hydrophones and geophones, are placed beneath glaciers or on sea ice to capture vibrations. These signals reveal how ice moves and fractures, how it flows over bedrock, and how it responds to changing temperatures. These sounds can be eerie. Low groans, sharp cracks, rhythmic pulses. Some are so deep they're felt more than heard. Together they create a kind of music of movement, each note corresponding to a shift in stress or a release of trapped air. By analysing these patterns, researchers can detect hidden currents, structural weaknesses, and early signs of collapse. The ice, in its own way, communicates through frequency and pressure. In other projects, scientists use radar and laser systems to map the interior of glaciers. These tools send pulses through the ice and measure the reflections that return. The data reveals layers, hidden cavities, and subglacial lakes. It's like taking an X-ray of the planet. Over time, repeated surveys show how the internal structure changes, where meltwater channels form, where flow accelerates, where the foundation beneath begins to shift. This information helps build models that predict how the ice will behave in the future. It also provides clues about what lies beneath, the sediments, minerals, and possible microbial habitats waiting in the dark. The work of these scientists is often solitary, but it relies on collaboration. Teams from different countries share data and coordinate logistics. Ice doesn't recognise borders, and neither can the study of it. International projects link stations across continents, creating a network of observation that covers both poles. Samples taken from the Arctic are compared to those from Antarctica, revealing similarities and differences that would be invisible otherwise. These collaborations are built on trust in methods, in integrity, in the shared goal of understanding something larger than any single nation or institution. One of the most famous centres for this work is the Ice Core Laboratory in Colorado, where thousands of samples from around the world are stored. Inside, the temperature is kept at -20 degrees Celsius. Scientists move slowly among the stacks, wearing insulated suits, handling each core with precision. They slice thin sections to examine under microscopes, scan them for impurities, and extract gases for analysis. Each measurement adds another detail to the global record. For the researchers who spend their lives studying these samples, the work becomes a kind of long conversation with the past, one that never truly ends. Beyond the technical and logistical challenges, there's a psychological aspect to life in these environments. Extended isolation, monotony, and sensory deprivation take their toll. The white horizon stretches endlessly, and the absence of familiar sounds can feel disorienting. Many scientists describe developing a heightened awareness of small details, the texture of snow underfoot, the sound of wind shifting direction, the faint colour change in the sky that signals the return of the sun after months of darkness. These small observations become anchors of reality in an otherwise abstract world. The shared experiences of polar researchers create a unique kind of camaraderie. In camps scattered across the ice, meals are communal, and stories circulate as a way to keep morale high. Humour becomes a form of resilience. Equipment failures, frostbite, and long nights are met with quiet endurance rather than complaint. There's a mutual understanding that the work is worth the discomfort. Everyone present, from senior scientists to support crew, contributes to the same purpose: to listen, measure, and document before time erases what they came to study. For many, the motivation to return year after year comes from a sense of humility. The ice is indifferent to human effort. It moves according to its own physics, responding only to gravity, temperature, and pressure. To work with it is to accept a role that is both privileged and temporary. Some researchers describe standing on a glacier at night, hearing distant cracks echo across the landscape, and realizing that they are surrounded by movement too slow to see, but powerful enough to reshape continents. The recognition of scale, both physical and temporal, leaves a lasting impression. It becomes part of why they continue. Their findings often travel farther than they do. Data collected in the field is shared with climate modelers, chemists, and oceanographers. Each data set becomes part of a larger framework linking the cryosphere to global systems. This integration allows predictions not just about local changes, but about the behaviour of the entire planet. The scientists who listen to ice know that their observations will inform decisions far beyond the frozen regions, policies on energy, agriculture, and conservation. They see their work as a bridge between natural history and human responsibility. At the same time, many express concern about how quickly the subjects of their study are disappearing. Glaciers retreat faster each year, and ice shelves that once seemed permanent now collapse without warning. Some of the researchers who began their careers studying stable systems now find themselves documenting their decline. The data they collect has shifted in tone, from understanding how ice forms to measuring how it fades. It's a transition they never hoped to see, but one they feel obligated to record. Their relationship with the ice becomes personal over time. They know its texture, its scent, the way it refracts light at different angles. They can distinguish between the sound of sea ice cracking and the deeper resonance of a glacier calving. Each sensory detail contributes to an intuitive understanding built through experience. That intuition often guides decisions in the field, helping them sense when conditions are changing or when danger is near. Listening, in this context, is not just scientific but instinctive. It's how they remain attuned to an environment that can shift from stillness to peril in moments. Despite the hardships, most of them describe their work with calm satisfaction rather than excitement. The rewards are rarely immediate. Progress comes slowly, through small increments of data and gradual refinement of models. Yet the cumulative effect is profound. Each sample, each measurement, contributes to a collective understanding that grows more detailed with time. The scientists understand that their efforts may not yield breakthroughs in their own lifetimes, but they continue nonetheless, adding their voices to the long dialogue between humanity and the frozen world. In recent years, technology has begun to change the nature of their listening. Automated sensors, satellites, and machine learning algorithms now process vast amounts of data from across the poles. Instruments buried in the ice transmit temperature and pressure readings continuously, forming a digital echo of the environment. Yet even with these advances, human presence remains essential. Machines can measure, but they cannot interpret experience. They cannot feel the subtle vibration underfoot that signals a change in flow, or sense the way light shifts through a thin layer of melting snow. Those perceptions still belong to the scientists who stand on the ice, listening not only with instruments, but with awareness. Their work is a blend of observation and endurance, a balance between intellect and patience. They move through landscapes that test their limits, extracting knowledge from places most people will never see. In doing so, they carry forward the memory of the ice itself, its movements, its chemistry, its role in shaping the planet. They are, in a sense, caretakers of time, preserving the story that the Earth continues to write beneath its frozen surface. And as the seasons pass and the Arctic changes, they remain there, listening, recording, and trying to understand what the ice is telling us about the past and about what's coming next. When the past begins to melt, it doesn't happen all at once. It starts quietly, as it always does in the Arctic. A trickle at the edge of a glacier, a thin sheen of water reflecting sunlight that once bounced harmlessly away. The sound is barely audible, a faint drip that grows with each passing day. To most people, it's the sound of thawing, of seasonal change. But to those who study the frozen world, it's the sound of time-shifting state. What had been locked away for thousands of years begins to move again. The air grows heavier with moisture and gas that haven't been free since before human civilization began. The ground softens, the ice sags, and everything that was preserved inside, chemicals, carbon, microbes, dust and memory, is set loose into the present. The first signs are physical. Rivers that used to freeze solid through winter now remain partially open. Permafrost, once so firm that drilling equipment could barely penetrate it, starts to crumble. Whole sections of tundra sink into uneven pools called thermokarst lakes. These lakes appear almost overnight, forming where ice-rich soil collapses under its own melting. They are beautiful in a stark way, reflecting the pale sky, but they are also clues that something deeper is changing. Beneath them, as ice turns to water, buried organic matter begins to decompose, releasing methane and carbon dioxide. What was once frozen stability becomes biological activity again. The scientists who listen to ice notice these changes first. Their measurements begin to shift. The ground temperatures rise slightly higher than expected. Methane readings spike earlier in the season. Ice cores taken from the same site year after year show new patterns in their layering, subtle increases in meltwater layers, indicating that freezing no longer dominates as it once did. In satellite images, glaciers retreat at a pace that can be measured in meters per year, faster than any historical record. The data confirms what the eye already suspects. The Arctic's memory is being erased as quickly as it's being studied. The implications of melting reach far beyond the ice itself. As frozen ground thaws, it releases more than gas. It exposes the remnants of ancient forests, bones of animals long extinct, and sometimes even the preserved remains of humans who lived in the Arctic thousands of years ago. Hunters in Siberia have found mammoths emerging from thawing cliffs, their flesh still intact, hair still visible, as if they had only recently fallen. The same process that fascinates scientists also raises difficult questions. When ice releases what it has preserved, it doesn't discriminate. It frees everything, the beautiful, the tragic, the forgotten. In a laboratory, thawed samples tell their stories slowly. Scientists analyse the water from melting permafrost and find not just carbon and methane, but traces of nutrients, minerals, and ancient microorganisms. Some of those microbes are dormant, their structures intact but inactive. Others, when given warmth and light, show signs of metabolic activity. The idea that life can pause for thousands of years and then resume unsettles our sense of time. It challenges the distinction between alive and dead. The melting ground becomes both graveyard and nursery, releasing forms of life that predate modern species and allowing them to interact with a world they never evolved to inhabit. The return of these organisms also reshapes the environment. Some decompose organic material, accelerating the release of greenhouse gases. Others contribute nutrients that feed modern microbial communities. The two merge, ancient and new, forming ecosystems that have never existed before. It's a slow fusion of eras, visible not in large animals or plants, but in invisible exchanges of molecules and energy. Scientists call this process microbial succession, but it's also a merging of timelines, where the ancient world begins to mix chemically with the present. As permafrost thaws, the landscape changes texture. Roads buckle, buildings tilt, and pipelines shift as the ground beneath them loses stability. What was once as solid as stone becomes unpredictable. In some Arctic towns, houses that stood firm for generations now need constant repair. Entire villages are relocating as coastal ice loss accelerates erosion. Rivers that once followed familiar courses carve new paths through softened terrain. The physical reshaping of the land is a visible counterpart to the invisible reshaping happening in the air and soil. It's as if the past, no longer content to stay buried, is pushing upward through every layer of the present. The scientists who monitor these shifts try to stay focused on data. They measure gas fluxes, map ground temperature profiles, and run computer models predicting future thaw rates. But even the most analytical minds can't avoid the emotional weight of witnessing change on this scale. Many describe the same feeling, that of watching something immense and slow unravel faster than expected. The sense of urgency grows with each field season, not out of panic, but from awareness that time, once frozen, is now moving again. One of the more revealing aspects of this melting is how uneven it is. The Arctic doesn't thaw uniformly. Some regions remain stable for decades, while others collapse suddenly. A small rise in average temperature can push an area past a threshold where ice transitions to water, and once that begins, feedback accelerates it. Water absorbs more sunlight than ice, which means more heat, more melting, and even more exposed dark surfaces. It's a loop that feeds itself, turning what used to be a slow geological process into a dynamic one unfolding within a human lifetime. Scientists studying methane release from these regions often describe it as a form of awakening. The gas isn't new, it's old, stored for millennia in the frozen soil, but as it escapes, it alters the atmosphere, adding warmth that in turn triggers more thawing. The process becomes cyclical, the planet's chemistry feeding back into its own transformation. The air above the tundra carries faint concentrations of these gases, measurable by instruments sensitive enough to detect parts per billion. Each molecule released represents a tiny fragment of the planet's ancient breath returning to circulation. The melting ice also releases sediments that were long sealed. Rivers turn cloudy with minerals and organic matter, changing the chemistry of coastal waters. This influx can feed plankton blooms that attract fish and birds, temporarily increasing biological activity in regions that were once barren. But the balance is fragile. Too much sediment reduces sunlight penetration, limiting photosynthesis and altering oxygen levels. In some areas, the mix of nutrients causes algae to spread rapidly, consuming oxygen and creating dead zones. These are small examples of how interconnected systems respond to even subtle changes in temperature and meltwater flow. In deeper layers of permafrost, scientists have found remnants of plant roots and ancient pollen, still identifiable under microscopes. These biological records help reconstruct past environments. What grew there, what climate prevailed, how ecosystems shifted over time. But as those layers thaw and decay, that information is lost. It's another form of erasure, slower than fire but just as complete. The ice that remembers everything is losing its ability to hold those memories, releasing them not as data but as decomposition. In some sense, the melting is also revealing how adaptable life can be. Microbes colonize meltwater pools within days. Mosses and lichens grow where bare ice once stood. In coastal zones, migrating species appear earlier each year following the retreating ice. New food webs form around meltwater lakes, creating habitats where none existed before. These signs of adaptation don't offset the loss, but they show that the planet responds dynamically. Change doesn't simply destroy, it reorganizes. The challenge for scientists is to document both sides, the loss of stability and the emergence of new systems, without losing perspective. For those who have worked in the Arctic for decades, the visual difference is startling. Satellite images from the 1980s compared to those from today show the ice sheet shrinking in size and thickness. Where once solid white extended unbroken, there are now patterns of blue, meltwater pools and dark patches of exposed rock. The ice retreats inland each summer, leaving behind scars in the landscape where glaciers once sat. Some of these changes are permanent. The ice once melted cannot reform under current conditions. What's lost doesn't return within any meaningful timescale. The Arctic is entering a new phase, one where ice is transient rather than constant. In research stations, discussions about these changes are constant. Scientists analyze trends, refine models, and debate projections, but beneath the technical language lies a shared understanding that the speed of change is exceeding expectations. The data suggests tipping points approaching faster than predicted. Each new measurement tightens the link between cause and effect, between warming and loss. The work becomes a race against time, not in pursuit of discovery but preservation, an effort to record the ice's story before it vanishes. The melting past also intersects with human history. Archaeological sites once buried under ice are emerging across the Arctic. Tools, clothing and bones are exposed as glaciers retreat, revealing fragments of cultures that lived and hunted here thousands of years ago. For archaeologists, it's a rare opportunity to study well-preserved artifacts. For climate scientists, it's another sign of how rapidly the frozen archive is unravelling. The same forces that reveal history are erasing it, as organic materials decay almost immediately after exposure. What was protected by cold for centuries can disappear in days once thawed. There's a growing sense among scientists that the Arctic's transformation is not only environmental but also temporal. Time itself feels different there now. The distinction between past and present blurs as ancient materials enter modern circulation. The carbon released from permafrost today may include atoms from plants that grew when ice first expanded across the poles. When that carbon burns in the atmosphere, it re-enters cycles that will influence future climates. In that way, the melting Arctic connects eras, prehistoric, historical and contemporary, into one continuous loop of matter and energy. Researchers trying to communicate these changes to the public often face a challenge of scale. The numbers are vast, the timelines long, and the feedback's complex. It's difficult to translate a shift in average ground temperature of 1 degree into the human sense of consequence. But for those who work on the ice, the meaning is concrete. They see the ground subsiding, hear the hollow echoes where it was once solid, and watch as rivers carve new routes through the landscape. The transformation isn't theoretical, it's physical, visible, and immediate. Despite the growing urgency, there's also restraint in how these scientists talk about the future. They avoid prediction beyond what data supports. The Arctic has always changed, though never this quickly, and certainty in complex systems is rare. Instead, they focus on measurement, collecting as much evidence as possible, knowing that future generations will interpret it with tools more advanced than ours. That humility defines the work: to observe without assuming, to record without concluding, to understand without dramatizing. The melting continues across seasons, sometimes slowing, sometimes accelerating. Each year brings new records: the lowest ice extent, the warmest winter, the earliest melt onset. Each year too brings new discoveries, as thawing exposes parts of the Earth we've never seen. Scientists document it all, balancing wonder with unease. They know that what they study is not just ice but time, and that time is slipping into motion once again. The past, once perfectly sealed, has begun to breathe, and as it does, it alters the present in ways we're only beginning to measure. Beneath everything that moves, there is stillness. It's not the kind that comes from absence or quiet, but from equilibrium. The balance that remains when motion slows and energy settles. Deep under the Arctic ice, below the shifting meltwater, below the frozen layers that record millennia of change, lies a kind of calm that resists time itself. Scientists call it the basal layer, the deepest part of the glacier where ice meets rock or sediment. It's a zone of immense pressure and near total darkness, where temperatures hover just below freezing and sound travels in slow, dull vibrations. If one could sit there long enough, there would be no sense of seasons, no difference between past and present. Everything that happens above filters down eventually, compressed, simplified, and absorbed into that frozen foundation. In that depth, water still moves, not in waves or streams, but in molecular shifts, creeping along grain boundaries, reshaping ice crystals atom by atom. The process is so slow that it defies normal perception. To human senses, it would seem motionless. Yet over centuries, that slow migration smooths the contours of the glacier, easing internal stresses and guiding the massive body of ice as it flows outward. It's an unseen engine, steady and self-regulating. The stillness beneath the Arctic isn't lack of motion. It's the kind of movement that happens too gradually to disturb the surface. Scientists study this hidden world with a mix of curiosity and respect. They know that what happens at the base determines what the glacier does above. Instruments placed in deep boreholes measure pressure, temperature, and vibration. The readings show that even the most solid ice pulses faintly, responding to tides, wind, and shifts in weight as snow accumulates or melts. The data looks almost like a heartbeat, slow, rhythmic, consistent. It reveals that the ice, even in stillness, listens to everything happening above it. Each vibration carries information about the world's state. Storms, warming, ocean currents. The Arctic, for all its quiet, is never unaware. When researchers lower microphones and sensors deep into boreholes, they often describe the experience as disorienting. The soundscape is nothing like the one at the surface. There are no winds or footsteps, only the low rumble of distant movement. The ice itself emits creaks and pops as crystals adjust to pressure changes. Occasionally there's a sharp crack, the release of stress accumulated over years. Then it fades again into the long sustained hum of compression. To listen to it is to hear time condensed into vibration, slow, vast, and impersonal. For those who spend their lives studying the Arctic, this stillness is both physical and psychological. After weeks or months in an environment where noise is scarce and movement minimal, perception changes. Scientists describe a sharpening of attention, a heightened sensitivity to small changes in light or temperature. Conversations become fewer but more deliberate. The rhythm of work slows to match the landscape. It's as though the environment trains its observers to adapt to its pace. In that adaptation, something fundamental happens. The sense of urgency that governs daily life elsewhere begins to fade, replaced by awareness that not everything must move quickly to matter. The stillness beneath the Arctic also exists within its ocean, under the floating ice cap that covers much of the polar sea. There, in the darkness below the ice, water moves in slow currents driven by density and salinity rather than wind. These currents circulate heat and nutrients across vast distances, connecting ecosystems that appear isolated from the surface. In the blackness, life persists. Small fish, jellyfish, plankton, and microbes that feed on chemical energy drifting from the depths. Instruments lowered through holes in the ice record this hidden motion. The readings show a paradox. Even in apparent stasis, the system is alive with activity too subtle for the eye to see. The stillness isn't emptiness, it's balance maintained through constant microscopic exchange. Some scientists compare this environment to the early Earth, when sunlight barely reached the oceans and life depended on chemistry alone. The microbes living here metabolize sulfur, ammonia, and methane, surviving in near-freezing temperatures where nutrients are scarce. They form thin films on ice crystals, clustering in brine channels that thread through the frozen water. Each channel acts as a miniature habitat containing its own community. The entire ice sheet becomes a network of interconnected microcosms. This structure mirrors patterns seen in much larger systems, rivers, weather, even human societies, where order arises from the sum of small, steady processes. In laboratories far from the poles, scientists simulate these under-ice conditions to study how biological and chemical systems achieve stability. They cool sealed chambers to sub-zero temperatures, add salts and organic compounds, and introduce microbial cultures. The results are consistent. As long as there is minimal energy and enough structure, balance emerges naturally. Microbes organize themselves into cooperative groups, sharing resources and maintaining conditions that allow all members to survive. It's a self-regulating stillness, fragile but persistent. The same principle operates in the Arctic, a quiet equilibrium built on cooperation between living and non-living matter. The concept of stillness extends beyond physical systems. It describes how the Arctic regulates the planet itself. The polar regions act as thermal anchors, reflecting sunlight and storing vast amounts of heat. Their stability moderates global temperatures and influences weather patterns across hemispheres. When ice melts or shifts, the balance changes. Ocean currents adjust, jet streams wander, and climates elsewhere respond. What happens in the Arctic, silent and remote as it seems, affects rainfall in the tropics and storms across continents. The stillness beneath the ice is the foundation of global motion above it. To the scientists who work there, this realization brings both awe and humility. Standing on the surface of a glacier that stretches beyond sight, they know that beneath them lies not emptiness but structure, a system so vast and intricate that it holds together the planet's climate. They collect data, calibrate instruments, and record changes, aware that each number represents a signal from that underlying equilibrium. When they speak of ice loss or temperature rise, they aren't describing distant phenomena. They're describing disruptions to the very balance that keeps the world system stable. There's also a human stillness that comes from living among ice for long periods. Many researchers describe moments when the constant noise of thought fades and only observation remains. The mind adjusts to the landscape's scale, learning to move at its pace. In those moments, they often notice details they'd have missed otherwise. The faint shimmer of refrozen meltwater, the way the air thickens with moisture at the start of a storm, the subtle vibration underfoot when distant ice shifts. These observations, while small, lead to insights that refine understanding. Listening, they realize, is as much about patience as about sensitivity. The stillness beneath all things also connects to time in a deeper way. The ice moves slowly, but it does move. Over centuries, glaciers creep outward, grinding rock into fine sediment, carving valleys, shaping coasts. The traces of those movements remain long after the ice retreats. In that sense, what we see now is the result of thousands of years of quiet motion. The present Arctic landscape is the surface expression of invisible persistence. To understand it requires thinking in intervals far longer than a human life. Scientists working there often talk about recalibrating their sense of time, seeing centuries as natural units, not abstractions. The ice teaches them that change can be both constant and imperceptible. This long perspective alters how they interpret the current era of rapid transformation. They recognize that the melting now underway doesn't erase the principle of stillness, it disrupts it. The equilibrium remains but shifts to a new configuration. Energy flows differently, Temperatures redistribute, ecosystems reorganize. The stillness endures, but its expression changes. It's no longer a frozen calm, but a dynamic balance adjusting to new conditions. Understanding this helps scientists separate emotional reaction from analytical observation. The system isn't dying, it's transforming. Though the consequences of that transformation may challenge life as it exists today, the idea that stillness and change coexist defines much of modern polar research. Instruments record motion even where the eye sees none. Cameras capture shifts that unfold over months but appear as flow when sped up. Computer models simulate glaciers as fluids that bend and stretch, revealing patterns invisible in real time. The data shows that the Arctic is a living system in slow motion, where stability arises from constant micro-adjustments. Every crack that forms, every grain of snow that compacts contributes to that self-balancing process. The stillness beneath the Arctic is not unique to it. Similar states exist throughout the planet, in the deep ocean, in the mantle, in the atmosphere above the stratosphere. Each represents a boundary where energy reaches temporary rest. Together they form a network of balances that make Earth habitable. The Arctic stillness is simply the most visible because it exists at the surface where we can touch it, measure it, and witness it as it changes. By studying it, scientists learn how stability itself functions, how systems can remain constant through constant motion. For the researchers who spend years in this environment, leaving it can feel disorienting. The noise of ordinary life seems louder, movements faster, time shorter. They describe a kind of after-image, the memory of silence and vastness that lingers after returning home. Some say it changes their sense of proportion, reminding them that the problems and pressures of daily existence are small compared to the scale of planetary processes. Others find that the patience they learn on the ice influences their work in other fields, teaching them to observe before acting, to understand systems before intervening. The Arctic stillness also plays a role in imagination. It provides a template for thinking about how other worlds might find balance. Planetary scientists use what they learn here to model the thermal dynamics of icy moons, to imagine how equilibrium might form in environments far from sunlight. The lessons are transferable. Energy can be stored in cold. Movement can occur without heat. Life can persist in balance with limitation. The principles derived from the Arctic reach beyond Earth, shaping how we look for stability in the universe. Even as the ice melts and reforms, even as temperatures shift, the stillness beneath it continues. It's built into the physics of matter, into the molecular structure of water itself. Each phase change, from vapor to liquid to solid, carries energy but also releases it, maintaining balance across transitions. The ice, in its quiet way, embodies that constant negotiation. It absorbs, releases, and adjusts without intention. The scientists who study it, in learning its rhythms, glimpse how balance operates on scales far beyond human control. They know that the stillness won't disappear, only move. As ice retreats, it may shift deeper underground or farther north. The planet's systems will find new points of equilibrium. Yet the memory of this stillness, of standing on a frozen plain that hums softly with internal motion, remains with those who've experienced it. They understand that beneath every storm, every melt, every transformation, there is a structure holding it together, unseen but present. The Arctic, for all its fragility, reminds them that stillness is not the absence of change, but the space that allows it to happen. And so, their work continues, listening, measuring, recording, not to stop the inevitable, but to understand it. In doing so, they preserve the link between what is moving and what remains unmoved, between the shifting surface and the calm foundation below. The stillness beneath all things endures, quiet and complete, as the world above it keeps unfolding in its endless cycles of freeze, thaw, and remembrance.